Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. The UN warns of dramatic consequences as tension mounts in northeast Syria between the Kurds and Turkish-backed groups. In a striking admission, Israel breaks its silence on the assassination of Hamas leader Haniyeh and vows the Houthis will face a similar fate. The CEO murder suspect Luigi Mangione is not backing down. He pleads not guilty in court as he faces a possible death penalty or a maximum sentence of life in prison without parole. To our top story now, fighting has broken out in northern Syria between the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces and the Turkish-backed SNA. Yesterday, the SDF said it had launched a counter-offensive around Manbij and the Tishreen Dam. The UN Special Envoy for Syria, Geir Pedersen, has spoken out about the escalating hostilities. He said the tensions between Kurdish-led authorities and Turkish-backed groups must be resolved politically or risk dramatic consequences for all of Syria. Meanwhile, we've also heard from the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who says the PKK and the YPG in Syria will either dissolve themselves or ultimately be destroyed. Erdogan also emphasized that he would respect Syria's territorial integrity, adding that the group's presence along the country's border is a red line for Turkey. For more on this, I'm joined by Murat Aslan, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hasan Kulcan University and Senior Researcher at SETA. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, reports suggest there are ongoing counter-offensive launched by the US-backed SDF, as we did mention earlier. What is the latest situation on the ground around Manbij?
Well, Manbij is very critical at the west of Euphrates River, as you may know. It's a foothold maybe to expand in the way to Afrin or Laskia. It was 2016, Turkey prevented it. But today, there was an agreement between the Syrian National Forces and PKK that Manbij should be evacuated, and they did it. And after a 4-day ceasefire, now they started a counteroffensive. I don't know why, but it's to capture Manbij, though. Manbij is a huge land. Once you evacuate it, it's very hard to achieve such a goal. On the other hand, the Turkish and Syrian national armies, ultimate goal is to eradicate PKK or at least push them to transform themselves, which is really free from the PKK influence, which is based in Iraq, but, pure Syrian Kurdish force or entity. On the other hand, there are a lot of impediments for this, and we can discuss.
Turkey has moved a lot of military assets in and around northern Syria. Erdogan has called on the YPG group to dissolve or face destruction, as I mentioned earlier. What exactly is he preparing for?
Well, the first priority, I believe, is to have Syrian National Army under the authority of the Damascus-based government, because they are now restructuring their defense forces, as you may know, and, just push PKK away from the Turkish borders. And also, Turkey is well aware of the fragility, especially in Raqqa, Haseki, Deir ez-Zor. Why? Because publics in these cities started uprisings across the streets protesting PKK. If this attempt fails, I think Turkey will push hard and maybe start a military operations. But Foreign Minister Fidan has proposed a 3-phase plan, especially to Syrian Democratic Forces, which is actually PKK right now, which was to expel the PKK members from the body at the east of Euphrates River first, and then transform themselves and clearing terrorist cells, at the eastern Euphrates River.
Negotiations are ongoing in the background between the US and Turkey. Would the Turkish government be willing to accept any deal that leaves the SDF or YPG in control of northeastern Syria?
Well, Republicans, Trump will have the power as of January 20th. And it's a turning point because it was 2 times last year Trump announced that the United States has nothing to do in Syria. And it was yesterday, the consultant to Trump, Waltz, repeated the same argument. That means Turkey is expecting a withdrawal of the U.S. forces. Well, it's something new maybe. On the other hand, that it was a fact maybe 4 or 5 years ago because Trump ordered the same thing. But it was James Jeffries, special representative to Syria of the United States, pushed a lot, not to stop this move. And today we are expecting a withdrawal of the U.S. forces as Turkish community. Then there may be a military operation. On the other hand, Turkey is very reluctant to start it before the withdrawal of the U.S. forces because Turkey does not want to clash with the U.S. That's a clear fact.
But what is going to happen to SDF in this region if we do see these US forces withdraw, as you have said? Is that not going to cause unrest?
Well, I don't think so, because SDF is currently collapsing. Why? The armed groups in Deir ez-Zor, the Arab tribes with Sunni descent, well, they quit from the SDF. I mean, now they are obeying the rules of Damascus-based government. Transition government. Second thing, if PKK commands the overall structure over there, their essential, stake is what Daesh members who are kept in the prisons. And the number of them is 8,000 people. Well, Turkey and Damascus-based government clearly proposed to the United States and the Western community that it must be the Damascus government in charge with such prisons. And there must be a clear justice process because we can't experience Guantanamo another time. In this sense, I believe the SDF will lose its credibility, first in the eyes of the Arab tribes, the east of Euphrates River, and second thing, once Syrian National Army or Turkish army starts a military operation, it will be maybe a medium-term quarrel, but it will marginalize PKK members because SDF will collapse.
Murat Aslan, Associate Professor of International Politics at Hasan Kalju University. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Earlier, the Manbij Military Council linked to the SDF released aerial photos showing the withdrawal of pro-Turkish fighters near Tishreen Dam and surrounding villages. Joining me now to discuss the SDF counter-offensive is Vladimir van Wilgenburg, a journalist and author of 2 books on the Syrian Kurds. Vladimir, thank you so much for joining us. I was just speaking to a Turkish professor there before you who suggested the FDS haven't gained much from this counter-offensive. What is your assessment of the situation?
Well, the last few days there have been heavy fighting. The Syrian Democratic Forces, they have pushed back Turkish-backed groups from some villages around Tishreen until the small town of Abu Qalqal. So they have benefited actually from the weather because not today, but the days before it was quite misty. So they have been benefiting from the fact that the SNA, they had lack of Turkish aerial support. So they have been pushed back a little bit. And also they have been having fighting on other fronts. And also Turkey has been carrying out drone strikes on SDF positions. But there was also a lot of rumors that the SDF entered Manbij, but that's not true. But they have captured some villages close to Tishreen Dam.
So it's not true that they've entered Manbij, as you say? Is that not happening?
No, they are still like a few kilometers away from Manbij, around 12 kilometers. But there's still heavy fighting in the area. And before these areas close to the dam, they were controlled by the Syrian National Army, but they have been pushed back from some of these villages close to Tishreen Dam.
The SDF launched this counter-offensive as negotiations with Turkey do remain ongoing. And you joined me recently and we spoke about what a possible deal would look like. What's the hold-up at the moment?
You mean the deal with America or a deal with Damascus?
Well, a deal to have peace in the region or to reach some sort of ongoing ceasefire, so a deal with Damascus.
Well, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're saying they're willing even to disarm if there's any form of recognition of Kurdish rights in Syria. They want to have a decentralized Syria where rights of minorities such as the Kurds and the Druze and also Christians are respected. So they want to have a form of decentralization, some form of autonomy for the Kurdish population also. So we have to see if these negotiations will happen in the future, because you saw that today there was a meeting between the de facto leader of Syria with armed factions that they say basically that no armed factions are allowed to have weapons. So we have to see how this is going to work. But in the past, the SDF had negotiations with the groups led by Ahmed al-Shara, by the HTS in Aleppo. And so far, there have been no fighting between the HTS and SDF forces in Aleppo or other areas.
ISIS remains a key concern for global and regional security, Vladimir. Around 50,000 members remain in prison in SDF-controlled areas. The new administration have offered to relieve them of their duty. Is this even possible?
Well, I mean, there's not only prisons, there's also several IDP camps where there are like 50,000 like ISIS families, basically. And then you have prisoners from with different nationalities from foreign countries, etc. So, I mean, it's possible, I mean, if there would be an agreement between the SDF and the new administration in Damascus to hand over those prisons to Damascus, but there have to be some form of bigger deal on what to do with Northern Syria. I mean, in general, there's a lot of countries that are actually afraid that if Turkey and Turkish-backed groups attack the SDF, those prisoners could escape. Because you saw that, for instance, in Deir ez-Zor, after the regime withdrawal, that a lot of prisoners, they escaped the prison, but among of them are like civilians that were like basically wanted by the regime, that were oppressed by the regime, but there's also different kind of people among them. Basically, all of them were released. So there's also a lot of Western countries, they're afraid if Turkey or the Turkish-backed groups will attack, that those prisoners could escape.
Kurds make up around 3% of the country's population, but now control between 30 and 40% of Syria's internationally recognized territory, including historically Arab majority areas. Do you think this is actually sustainable?
Well, I mean, as a former Turkish analyst, the Turkish analyst that we're talking before, the SDF until now is not collapsing. The reason for that is that because 60% of the SDF, they are Arabs. So it's a Kurdish-led force, but it's maintaining other components like Christians and Arabs. So this coalition was created basically to fight ISIS with US support. So it's a multi-ethnic coalition. And also, if you look to the administration that is built, it's not like a Kurdish administration. There's Arabs in it, people from Raqqa, from Deir ez-Zor and other areas. So it's not really, it's reflective of the demography of northeast Syria. But we have to see in the future negotiations how it can work if this administration can stay in power in those areas, or they're going to find a different method. Because there's also possible, for instance, that the Kurdish-led administration will, for instance, give the new authorities in Damascus control over things like the airport and oil and gas resources, but that locally they can still have some form of local security forces under their control. But we have to see how it's going to work if this new administration will accept some form of decentralization, because not only Kurds demand this, but also, for instance, Christians and Druze.
Vladimir van Wilgenburg, journalist and author of 2 books on the Syrian Kurds. Thank you so much for joining me. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. At least a dozen people have been killed and 4 injured following an explosion in northwest Turkey. Footage from the scene shows a massive fireball erupt from the ammunition and explosives factory, followed by plumes of dark smoke. According to the Turkish Interior Minister, sabotage has been ruled out, and the cause of the accident does remain unknown. Now, former US President Bill Clinton has been hospitalized after developing a fever. The 78-year-old was admitted to MedStar Georgetown University Hospital in Washington for, quote, testing and observation. The former US President's Deputy Chief of Staff saying he is, quote, in good spirits. And many residents in Victoria evacuated as bushfires rage in the southeast Australian region. Firefighters trying to contain the blaze and residents given but a few hours to collect their belongings. Across the country, a string of fire warnings and severe heat forecasts just a day before Christmas. In Russia, scientists have found the remains of a 50,000-year-old baby mammoth in Serbia. It has earned the title of the world's best preserved mammoth carcass, named Yana, found in permafrost. The remains weigh over 100 kilograms and is 4 foot tall. Now, the man accused of fatally gunning down United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in New York pleaded not guilty, even though the state criminal courthouse revealed handwritten pages that expressed hostility towards the health insurance industry and its wealthy executives. Luigi Mangione faces 11 state charges, including murder and terrorism. If convicted, he faces life imprisonment without parole. Meanwhile, in the federal case, he could face the death penalty. Mangione is expected to appear in court on the 21st of February. Now, social media has labelled Luigi Mangione as a hot assassin. His lawyer says the high publicity could impact the final judgment by the court.
He's a young man, and he is being treated like a human ping-pong ball between 2 warring jurisdictions here. These federal and state prosecutors are coordinating with one another, but at the expense of him. They have conflicting theories in their indictments, and they are literally treating him like he is like some sort of political fodder, like some sort of spectacle. He was on display for everyone to see in the biggest staged perp walk I've ever seen in my career. Your Honor, I'm very concerned about my client's right to a fair trial in this case. He's being prejudiced by some statements that are being made by government officials. Like every other defendant, he is entitled to a presumption of innocence. But unfortunately, the way this has been handled so far, his rights are being violated.
Luigi Mangione escorted into court on Monday. He maintains his innocence despite what prosecutors say is a bulk of evidence suggesting he committed the crime. They point to a notebook found in his possession in which entries express hostility towards the healthcare insurance industry and wealthy executives in particular.
Hi, I'm Brian Thompson.
One of whom was billionaire Brian Thompson, who headed the US's largest health insurance company. But Mangione's lawyer believes her client is being unfairly treated, arguing he's just a young man handled like a human ping-pong ball, blasting this high-profile Hollywood-style manner in which he was paraded in front of cameras during his perp walk. That call for sympathy for the 26-year-old is being heeded. As Mangione entered court, he was met with a chorus of protesters demanding his freedom.
I think it's awful that someone lost their life, but at the same time, I think that this is a sign that something needs to change. You know,
I myself, my family have financial problems and stuff. My mom has problems with getting health insurance and stuff, so it does kind of touch me personally.
A recent survey showed that 41% of young people stateside believe that Brian Thompson's murder was justified, with Mangione widely hailed as a folk hero online for allegedly attacking profit-driven corporate America. Social media is awash with jokes over the killing, as is mainstream TV.
Luigi Mangione dropped...
This is NBC's comedy programme Saturday Night Live. The very mention of Mangione's name greeted with applause amongst audience members. That sort of reaction has been condemned by elected officials.
I want to send a very clear and loud message that this act of terrorism and the violence that stems from it is something that would not be tolerated.
Yet this case is serving as a sign of a country disunited. A debate is bubbling over not just a suspect, but a system. Benji Haya, Al Arabiya News.
Now, for the first time, Israel has claimed responsibility for killing Ismail Haniyeh, the former Hamas leader. That's after Defense Minister Israel Katz acknowledged that Israel was behind the assassination of Haniyeh, who was staying at a guest house in Tehran to attend the inauguration of Iran's president.
We will strike hard at the Houthis and decapitate their leadership, just as we did with Haniyeh, Sinwar, and Nasrallah in Tehran, Gaza, and Lebanon. We will do so in Hodeidah and Sana'a. Anyone who raises a hand against Israel will have his hand cut off, and the long arm of the IDF will strike him and hold him accountable.
In Israel's view, the Houthis will face consequences similar to those experienced by other pro-Iranian factions. Speaking to the Knesset, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu affirmed this, stating that he had ordered the Israeli army to carry out attacks against Houthi targets. He added Israel will not turn a blind eye to Iran and will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
We do not turn a blind eye to Iran or its desire to destroy us. We will prevent it from possessing a nuclear weapon. We assess all the dangers and threats, and I, along with Defense Minister Katz, have directed the army to destroy Houthi targets and infrastructure in Yemen.
Regarding the Gaza truce, Netanyahu declined to provide the Knesset with details of prisoner swap talks, stating that progress has been made but cannot be disclosed.
I cannot tell you everything we are doing. We are taking important steps regarding the hostages. There has been some progress in the hostage deal talks for three main reasons. First, Yahya Sinwar is no longer with us. Second, Hamas has lost hope that Iran and Hezbollah will come to its aid. And third, Hamas is receiving blows and is under constant military pressure. So there is progress, but I do not know how long it will take. I cannot disclose details.
For more on this, I'm joined by Yossi Mansharof, an expert on Iran and Iranian proxies at the Misgav Institute for National Security. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Israel has broken its silence on the assassination of the Hamas leader. Why now?
Good evening. I think that its main idea is to deter Iran from promoting an attack against Israel for the recent crucial attack that Israel has done against Iran for the first time in the history of the Iranian regime. The regime is attacked in different 20 points, including one nuclear facility and so many military facilities. So now the main goal of Israel is to deter Iran, not to carry out its coming attack. They promised so many times to launch the attack, and Israel is doing its best to deter Khamenei and the leadership of the security and political system in Tehran.
Was the announcement from Israel Katz a chance for Israel to reveal its broader regional strategy of dismantling threats from Iranian proxies? Do you think that's what he was doing?
Until now, I think we see a major success of Israel. In Gaza, Hamas is almost eliminated. In Lebanon, we see Hezbollah, which suffered a major blow. We see the resistance axis, which is very weak now after the dismissal of Assad. And only yesterday, we heard about the decision of the Iraqi Shiite militias to suspend the attacks against Israel. So I think that Khamenei and the leadership in Tehran feel this blow, and now they should recalculate their decisions against Israel.
What can...
Only the Yemenite arena...
Sorry.
Only the Yemenite arena is still so extensively operating against Israel.
What can Iran do to protect and support the Houthis now? As you say, they have lost Assad in Syria. Hezbollah remains heavily weakened. What's next?
I think that the main goal of Israel is now to promote a joint strategy with the incoming Trump administration in order to push the resistance axis led by Iran as much as possible back. Iran, since the Islamic Revolution, established a regional order. We saw it by so many proxies that Iran established and nurtured in Lebanon, the Gaza Strip, in Syria, even in Saudi Arabia during the 80s, it was called Hezbollah Hijaz. In Yemen, in Bahrain, the main problem of the region is Iran, and now Israel should target the Houthis until that Trump will be sworn, and then to promote a joint coalition led by Iran and led by America, and with the support and the participation of regional Sunni countries such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and others, in order to push Iran back. The 7 October massacre, we saw the disaster result of this attack. It was backed by Iran, and Israel cannot longer tolerate any such a major threat by Iran or is...
Yossi Mansar, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you. Now, for some of the top business news, Eric Lombard, the head of the state-backed financial group Caisse de Dépôt, has been named the new French finance minister. The French Prime Minister's pick will handle the country's budget from 2025. Dépôt takes over from Antoine Armand. Now, Volkswagen shares were down almost 3% in early trading today, with analysts citing uncertainty about the carmaker's cost-cutting deal with the unions. Last week, VW announced sweeping changes to its German operators, with more than 35,000 future job cuts. As part of the deal between the automaker and unions representing workers, there would be no immediate site closures or layoffs. On to sports news now. Arsenal forward Bukayo Saka will be out for several weeks after suffering a hamstring injury during Saturday's Premier League win at Crystal Palace. Saka will miss this coming Friday's league game against Ipswich Town at Emirates. Saka has recorded 5 goals and 10 assists in the league this season, helping Arsenal to third place in the standings. Staying with football news, Manchester United manager Ruben Amorim has questioned the choices of those close to forward Marcus Rashford, whose time at Old Trafford could be coming to an end. The 27-year-old England international sat out at a third straight game on Sunday as United did lose to Bournemouth. Rashford was also left out of the squad for the derby win at Manchester City earlier this month and Thursday's League Cup quarter-final defeat by Tottenham. Tensions between Rashford and the club increased following an interview in which Rashford acknowledged he was ready for a new challenge. Now, two-time Grand Slam doubles champion Max Purcell has been provisionally suspended after admitting a breach of anti-doping rules. Purcell, whose major titles came at Wimbledon in 2022 and this year's US Open, said he had unknowingly received an intravenous infusion of vitamins, which was above the 100 ml limit allowed by the World Anti-Doping Agency. He reported the issue to the International Tennis Integrity Agency after he received his medical records, and that was last week. A reminder of our top stories. The UN warns of dramatic consequences as tension mounts in northeast Syria between the Kurds and the Turkish-backed groups. Now, in a striking admission, Israel breaks its silence on the assassination of Hamas leader Haniyeh and vows the Houthis will face a similar fate. The CEO murder suspect, Luigi Mangione, is not backing down. He pleads not guilty in court as he faces a possible death penalty or a maximum sentence of life in prison without parole. And that's all for us on W News. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you all have a really lovely Christmas Eve. Riz Khan and Hadley Gamble are coming up next, and don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Just days after America's chaotic and deadly withdrawal from Afghanistan, a daring film crew embedded themselves with the Taliban, capturing a story the world has never seen before. Over the course of the year, they documented the shocking realities of a group totally unprepared for power, but wielding billions of dollars in abandoned U.S. military hardware.
Odessa Rae, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. I want to kick off by asking you what brought you to this project.
In those first days after the U.S. pullout, they were quite euphoric and sort of willing to give access, willing to give interviews. They sort of were presenting themselves as this Taliban 2.0, you know, different from the previous Taliban, and in that, within that package, willing to sort of do interviews. And that was the window that Ibrahim went in with. And keeping that access over 1 year was much harder than actually getting it in the first place. And even though getting it, we got it with the lower level Mukhtar, the second character, and sort of worked his way up to the big boss.
I noticed this sort of tendency throughout the film for these guys constantly to be looking over their shoulder, in the sense they were always fearful of being infiltrated. And no doubt this was something that they feared as well.
For sure. For sure. Especially, I think, the longer he stayed, because they just, you know, it's like they even explain in the film, they're like, well, what's he doing? He's making a documentary. It's like a movie, but with real people, you know? And I think that But what's interesting about that is he had one person with him, his translator, Adel, who was really trusted, and he was like the only person that was with Ibrahim really this whole time. And the first time that there was this kind of threat voiced towards Ibrahim while he was filming, Adel translated it, and he said to Adel, "Don't ever translate that stuff to me again." And he didn't. He really listened to that. And when we got into the edit and we started translating all the material, Ibrahim himself was surprised in these moments. Like, he'd send me screenshots from the translation team, just like, "Oh my God, look at this."
Yeah.
You know, and that was sort of when that whole side of it started to become more apparent.
And more real to him, no doubt.
Yeah.
But keeping it for later,
yeah,
he was probably able to focus more.
Yeah. And keep going back, because he took breaks. He would go for like a certain period, 6 to 8 weeks or something, until he could feel like they were just tired of him, you know?
Yeah.
And then he would leave, and he would sort of wait until, you know, give them a moment, and then start approach again, like, "Can I come back? I really need to film this, da, da, da." And he would go back again. And each time going back, I think he was just quite nervous about everything.
Taking a bigger risk.
Taking a bigger risk, yeah.
So to do what's been done in Hollywoodgate, to take those risks as a filmmaker, that's something that is difficult for other people to get their head around. Why in the world would you risk your life to go be with people that, as you say, the world has a very, very negative perception of? Why was this important? And frankly, does he fear for his life?
Well, I think Ibrahim, deep down inside, does have some kind of fear for the risk that he's taken and the position that it puts him in now, also being a spokesperson for this film.
Yeah.
But he would never admit it, because he felt and feels so deeply for the pain that the Afghan people are going through.
Yeah. And you see multiple times in the film where they're questioning why he's there. You know, there's one statement about if he doesn't do what he says he's going to do and keep his word in terms of representing us, we'll kill him.
Yeah. Which actually he didn't know fully, because he told his translator, who was with him the whole time, after the first threat came through, he was like, "Don't translate that stuff for me." And Adele actually listened, and so those things were discovered in the edit later, and he'd be sending me screenshots saying, "Oh my God, look what they're saying," you know? So he wasn't fully aware, but he definitely felt it. He wasn't ignorant to it. Yeah. And the last day, the parade that we shot, that was the last thing we shot, because it was very clear to him that that was dangerous. Yes, exactly. Because we had sort of been filming within one section of the leadership, but on that day, all the leadership was there. And Ibrahim was the only person on that stage with a camera.
Yeah.
And so other parts of the leadership, I think the head of security, et cetera, they noticed him, and they were like, "Wait, who are you and what are you doing here?
Yes.
And you're coming with us." And he actually ran away from that after the parade, went straight to Kabul airport and caught the first plane out, and that was the last time that he was there.
Yeah.
And the burner phones that we had with the subjects, he deleted them and, you know, stopped those accounts after a few weeks of leaving.
The very idea of going in to a place like Afghanistan, where the U.S. has just, you know, made this disastrous withdrawal, putting your feet on the ground when you know that your life will be at risk in every moment. Most people would say, he must be crazy.
I know.
Is Ibrahim crazy?
No, he's just a deeply empathetic person. He grew up in Egypt.
Yeah.
He grew up, you know, also observing. He also was a journalist before at Al Jazeera.
Yes.
And when he was a journalist, he worked in a TV show where they interviewed prominent leaders in the Middle East, etc. And he observed, you know, groups like the Taliban throughout his years growing up in journalism, and how people sort of revered them. And he always questioned this sort of praise of these kind of groups. And he knew that when they were coming back into power, that it meant devastation for the Afghan people. And I think he just felt deeply compelled to not allow that to be forgotten. And
to tell that story.
Yes, exactly, and tell that story. And he, honestly, he just, he really didn't think of the danger, and also the psychological toll that it takes on you, because we had to get him therapy, like in between.
Yes.
And this was really helpful because it's very difficult to sort of be within an ideology all day long that you don't agree with and not be able to say anything.
To lose your voice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he, early on, there's one story that he told recently that I only heard recently from him, that in the early days, there was one younger Talib who seemed really intelligent, and he sort of had a dialogue with him, and he was like, you seem so intelligent, like, why are you in this? Why are you doing, like, you could get a degree, you could be an engineer, you could go and, like, do something with your life. And that young Talib went to his commander and was like, you know what, I don't want to do this. I want to go and be an engineer, and I have other dreams maybe for myself. And the commander was like, where did you get these ideas?
Wow.
And he said, well, that cameraman.
Wow.
And he was called here, do you ever say something like that again? Like, you're dead,
Wow.
And so that he then kept his mouth shut. He understood that saying anything to anyone was going to endanger him.
Yeah.
And he kept his mouth shut, and he kept his camera rolling. And he kept his camera rolling, there's so much that we had to shoot to sort of just appease them.
No doubt.
Like all their propaganda ideas, right? Because this film's very much about how they think they're going to use,
how they
learn
perceived
from Hollywood, which is part of the title, even though it's on the gate, about propaganda. Oh, okay, now maybe we should start to create propaganda.
Yes.
And they're even learning that to use on their own people now, right? This narrative of, oh, the West is this, the infidels, the whatever, right? Propaganda is such a powerful tool in the mechanisms of creating war and control, right?
Yes.
Controlling society. And we had to shoot, so he was always watched and controlled what he would shoot, right? And the bits that we made the film with were like the bits in between when they forgot, because he spent so many hours there. And he would sit in rooms just holding the camera on them so they'd forget about the camera.
Yes.
And it wouldn't even be on because he knew he was shooting stuff that he's not going to use. For hours and hours, they forget about the camera, they forget they're mic'd up, and then click, start rolling.
That's the moment.
And and the film was built through those in-between moments.
Yeah, it's fascinating the idea of that bird's eye view in those very first days, because it was very clear that they, as the Taliban, had stumbled into a victory that they never anticipated.
Yeah.
And you really see, I mean, as someone who covered the departure from Afghanistan, at least from a journalist's perspective, what it must have been really like for them walking into those buildings and seeing the mess that the coalition forces had left behind. And even they were surprised. How could they have left all of this here?
Yeah, right?
Like total surprise.
No, and even a friend of mine who's incredibly intelligent, when she watched the film, she was like, honestly, I don't even look at it as like the Taliban and this and that. It's like one sort of foreign group, almost anthropological study of like what happens to a certain culture when they come in contact with another culture, right? Because they start to pick up these things and these objects, and they see all these objects, and you can see when they are walking out of the caves, they say, well, if we had all this stuff, we would rule the world, right? So it's how these things start to infuse them also with ideas and change the way they think even, right? And then they fix the weapons and what they, how they end up with like calling the Tajikistan and threatening them.
I found it very interesting as well. I mean, walking into that hangar, the shots of the planes.
Right.
For me, this just sort of in every way symbolized, frankly, what America, sadly, has become in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And it was hearkening back to the days of Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. And we heard that analogy made time and time again. In your mind, what does this film mean in terms of a broader representation of what's happened over the last several years? Because if you look at the fall of Afghanistan, this disastrous departure, And then 4 years on, we have multiple wars, a deeply destabilized Middle East, even right now what's happening in Syria. And many would say that this is a direct result of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan, that this started a chain reaction. Putin would not have invaded Ukraine. Israel would not be doing what it's doing in Gaza, et cetera. And that may be a false assertion, but certainly to those who've watched the region as I have, and you have for decades, it feels as if that was the beginning.
Yeah. War begets war begets war.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it ever the solution? I mean, obviously, we look at that and we question this war machine, right? You have to question, is that the way to do it? Because, no, we set these weird, unreachable goals, right? It started in Afghanistan as we're going after bin Laden, and then it became
nation building,
freedom, democracy. Look at Iraq. Like, it's not working.
Yeah.
We have to obviously come up with a different way forward.
Yeah. When you think about sort of, you picked Hollywoodsgate, you also obviously did Navalny. What do these types of films mean to you?
The truth, you know? I think it's really important in film. What can you see through a film? 90 minutes with Alexei Navalny, I feel like, will give you so much more understanding of him as a human being than whatever you read in the news, you know, 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. It's like you lived with him. You felt his sincerity, right?
Yes.
Watching what we left behind, Afghanistan now, just the destruction and the people that are suffering there. You know,
it's incredible.
It's like the Western media would love us to just forget and they don't focus on it anymore.
Exactly.
And that's what hopefully this film will get people to do, is just look at it. We don't just move on from Iraq. We don't just move on from Afghanistan. Afghanistan's still there. Iraq is still there. It has Syria.
Yeah.
You know?
These are the messes we've left behind.
Exactly.
I've challenged several world leaders, most recently the First Lady of Pakistan, about Afghans women and the situation in which they find themselves consistently rolling back every freedom. And the narrative that we see is that we gave them great promise for 20 years and then we utterly abandoned them.
I mean, it's horrific. Women right now, like, you know, the laws that were passed recently, they cannot speak outside of their own home. They can't go to a park with their child.
Yeah.
They can't go grocery shop. Like, they have to be, you know, supervised by a man. And still at the grocery store, I was speaking to an Afghan refugee recently whose wife is still in Kabul. I was like, so if she needs to go to the grocery store, how does that work? You know, he says, my brother or my uncle or someone comes over and takes her to the store. But still, even at the store, she can't speak. So she wants tomatoes. It's like, like trying to gesture. Can you imagine a woman, like even in a grocery store, which is, I mean.
They're erasing women.
It's completely, you can't sit like on the outside of your house and face the sun, right? You can't sing even inside your own house because your voice might carry. You can't read aloud inside your own house certain things. You can't have conversations with other women about certain topics. Like, those women are in prison.
One of the characters in the film, one of the people in the film, has basically said to his wife, you can't be a doctor anymore. You have to stay home. You have to follow Sharia. And this caused quite a bit of a conversation because the implementation of Taliban 2.0 was still in those early days up for debate.
Right. And can you imagine, had he let his wife be a doctor and maybe come to that base with him when they discover all those medicines that are left behind by our army, right? And what she would have maybe seen in those medicines and been able to implement it and at least get it into society before they all expired for the general population. Obviously, they don't care about the general population because those sat there expiring and his wife sat at home cooking.
When you think about your subjects, the way you choose to get involved in films, what is the one sort of similarity that they all have?
Fighting for the truth to be seen.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's something that just drives me. You know, it's like you're dealing with situations that are so sensitive, people that are holding a lot, politically sensitive, emotionally, you know. And when you are a documentarian, you have to sort of embed in those situations. You become very close to the subjects, right? I lived in the Black Forest with Alexei Navalny, and Yulia, etc., for months, and was there the last day that we put him on the plane back to Russia, you know, and carrying Ibrahim through Hollywood Gate. It's you become very close, right? And yet you have to sort of make sure that you still keep a distance enough to make an objective film.
Yeah.
Which
you
is
go
challenging.
Into these, no doubt. I mean, you go into these situations perhaps with the preconceived notion of what it is you want to do or what you expect to see, and that, I assume, gets blown up pretty quickly.
I go into situations where we don't have an idea, and those are the situations that excite me.
Yeah.
That just like, let's follow it. You know, like when we went in to meet Alexei Navalny, we didn't know they were going to make this phone call to Kudratsev. We didn't know he was going to go back. We just knew he'd been poisoned, and he was sitting, and he had just come out of a coma, and what was happening to this interesting figure, you know? So I feel like I'm sort of drawn to the person, because I know the person is going to walk an interesting path.
Yes.
And let's see where that path goes. So even the film I shot in Ukraine during the war, I was covering negotiations between Russia, Ukraine at first, but then those fell apart very quickly, and it became negotiations for weapons, negotiations with foreign nations, diplomacy. So I was very close to Kuleba while he was foreign minister, Rustem Umerov, who became the Minister of Defense. And I had no idea every day sort of where that story would go, you know?
Yeah. When you were shooting with Alexei Navalny, did you have a sense then that he was getting on a plane to his death?
No, absolutely not. And I don't know. He's such an optimistic person that he knew he was heading into potentially a grave challenge. But at the same time, I think 50% of him hoped that everything would be fine, you know? I think that he even hoped that upon immediate return, he would potentially not even go to prison, you know, because truth was on his side. And Navalny was someone that believed in the truth. And the trials that he was facing at that time were these sham trials. And then they sort of put him in prison for a small period of time. And then they started implementing all these new laws around extremism, around terrorism, right? They retroactively labeled his organization a terrorist organization and then tried him for that. That wasn't even existing when he was leaving. And the war hadn't started yet. So he sort of we didn't really fully know how far Putin was willing to go.
In hindsight, it's easier to say, oh, he was naive.
Right.
But you don't see it that way.
No. I think that when you are someone like Navalny who, you know, commits to fighting for that kind of path, for the future of the country the dream that you hold for that country, you have to be an optimistic person.
Yeah.
You know?
Obviously, in Hollywood Gate, there were opportunities to frankly break news, as we would say. And I'm talking about, you know, the Russians and what they were attempting to do in Afghanistan, fighting a covert war, essentially.
Well, you know, Christo Grozev, who I worked with so closely on Navalny, he is just the most genius investigator. And for the last 4 years, he's been on and off working on an investigation about Russia's involvement with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And then he saw I sent him early footage when I started working on it, because I was like, look, this is really interesting. But at that point, we hadn't shot these shots at the end with Arkhipov and the Russians, Iranians, etc., that you see on the stage at the end of the film. And when he saw the full film, I think it was in June here in London, he immediately, in his sort of Christo style, did like the reverse face search and started figuring out who's this Russian guy on the stage. And it was the missing link to this huge investigation around a Russian bounty program where they were basically paying the Taliban per head of U.S. soldier that they were able to kill, which led to many suicide bombings and
some of the biggest attacks.
Right, attacks on U.S. convoys, U.S. bases. And this was at the time covered up because the negotiations with the White House, with the Taliban were going on. And then even when Biden came to power, it was continued. They continued to sort of not look at that situation, and so
as if not to muddy the waters.
Right, and this whole investigation is now out, as you see in
the New York Times. Yeah, it's to a journalist, it looks as if just the great game is alive and well when you're talking about so many different powers. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you see reports of Russian interference, whether it be in Afghanistan or elsewhere, elections, for example, in the United States, you don't find any of this surprising.
No, and I think that is the genius of this kind of filmmaking and documentary filmmaking, where you just capture and you're there and you capture. Like at the time, we didn't know that we were capturing these individuals, right?
Yeah.
And you just make the film, and these kind of films are so hard to make and so hard to distribute these days. Mm-hmm. And I hope that this huge investigation shows the value of this kind of filmmaking, that it helps us sort of. You know, it's a deeper look and a deeper investigation, and helps us to understand the world we're living in better.
I imagine that sort of ability to spend the time, to engage with the people at this kind of level, over days, over months, over years. Mm-hmm. Very different from what the mainstream media is able to accomplish simply because of budget. What is the toughest thing in that sense for documentary filmmakers? Is it the budgeting? Is it the time constraints? I mean, where's the sort of challenge there?
It's the life.
Because you are giving up your
limitation,
life.
right?
Yeah.
Like in Ukraine, I think I'd lived there for 6, 7, 8 months, sort of back and forth on those overnight trains. You know, living
it's
out
literal
of
immersion.
Suitcase. It really is, and you just like, as far as another life, like I don't have a family, I don't have kids. You know, it is. It takes...
That's what it requires.
It does. It requires a lot from you.
Yeah. Do you think that the value there, obviously, is that you do get that firsthand knowledge?
Yes, and like for me, I just love it. You know, I love my work. I love understanding the truth, like being able to be with Kuleba and Rustem, etc., during like these critical points, and just watching the day-to-day unfold. You have an understanding of this war, of this conflict, of the multiple sides to it, and nothing is black and white. Yeah. You know, and I have, even with the Alexei, with Navalny, sitting there in the Black Forest for those days and knowing them so well, you just understand things in a different way, in a deeper way than, I don't know. And that for me is super fulfilling.
No doubt, no doubt.
I mean, I'm sure that's what drives you as a journalist as well. It's just like having these conversations, having these intimate understanding of different perspectives, you know. And I've always been someone who loves different perspectives because I grew up that way. Like I lived in Asia, I lived in Canada, Japan, all these cultures that you had to sort of assimilate into. And that for me is life, really. Like when I can, it doesn't necessarily mean I agree with all the perspectives, but just being able to see different perspectives is super fulfilling.
What was most surprising to you in making Hollywoodgate?
Well,
the scenes where they are in the gym.
I would say, the gym, for sure. Yeah, but
high on the unintentional comedy scale.
Yeah, exactly, unintentional comedy scale. But I think just how deep the ignorance is, also. You know, around their vision, their definition of women and women's society around women, and just their narrative around the world, even. Like, it's just, you know, they have had zero exposure to, like, you know, what's happening outside that little bubble.
For filmmakers, you're there for a long time. Mm-hmm. How does timing work?
Yeah, and then, you know, it's so key. Like, for example, we had to put out Hollywoodgate in an election year. Yeah. Which was difficult because it sort of shows a critical look at what happened around the pullout, which then everyone ends up blaming Biden for. So then people are afraid to...
The politicizing of the film.
The politicizing of the film, but it has nothing to do with Biden. This is a problem that was created over 20 years with
multiple administrations.
2 Democratic, 2 Republican. Yes. And it's like, we just need to look at this as a whole and as a country, as an American citizen, it's my responsibility to question our foreign policy.
Yeah.
And yet, like, you know, people are so afraid that it would be, you know, looked at as troublesome for Biden, and that's just the wrong lens to look at it through.
Do you think that
it was very difficult?
No,
I think it is. It really is. That problem was created by 4 different administrations.
Yeah.
They all equally hold the burden, and they, you know, should have communicated and come together to create a different solution there. Not each new administration coming in and creating their own goals, right?
Yeah. What do you want audiences to walk away with from Hollywoodgate?
Well, I think Hollywoodgate walks this fine line of, you see the Taliban that are, you know, in the Western media, we've spent 20 years pushing one narrative of them, which is just problematic, and these killers that are just living in caves and they're just killing and killing, killing. And then you see in the Taliban in Hollywoodgate that they also eat, they also sleep, they also are funny, they're
human.
Kind of weird. They're human, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, not apologizing for them, not saying like, okay, wait, just not trying to humanize, but at the same time seeing that they are humans, looking at this and going, okay, hold on a second. Maybe we should try a different approach, right? Because they're obviously just deeply uneducated, are a product of 40 years of war, that have only lived in caves and been taught war, and grown up with war, fed war.
Yes.
Right? And is there something else that we can do? Is there some other approach that we can take?
Yeah. Odessa Rae, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Bangkok. It's the city of angels and the Venice of the East. Bangkok is one of the most visited cities in Southeast Asia. Thailand's capital city brings hundreds of thousands of visitors from all over the world each year. The largest and most developed city in Thailand, Bangkok offers tourists a mix of modern and upscale sights and sounds while maintaining its old charm from its historical architecture and traditions that date back to hundreds of years. One of the most famous is Wat Arun, located on the west bank of Chao Phraya River opposite the Grand Palace. This is a must-see site in Bangkok, as the architectural design is completely unique to that of other temples in Thailand's capital. You can even climb its steep 70-meter high spire, which boasts the best views of Bangkok's skyline. While it is also known as the Temple of Dawn, Wat Arun is best at night when lit up, as it gives off a golden beam of light over the Chao Phraya River. The Grand Palace is the capital's most glorified and world-renowned structure. It was once the home of the Thai king, the royal court, and the administrative seat of government, and was built back in 1782. Marvel at its ancient designs, from the diverse array of Buddhist sculptures and temples that flow through the vicinity. Most popular is the Wat Prakil, or the Temple of the Emerald Buddha. Bangkok is also well known for its busy market scene. Anchored on either side of the river are boats stocked with fresh tropical fruits and veggies, coconut juice, and local food being cooked on open grills. Also popular are the floating markets Damnon Sadwak, Ampawa, and Klong Lat Mayong. Likewise, Bangkok's mall scene is alive and kicking, with enough shops stretching from Siam along Sukhumvit Road to last a lifetime. Also within Bangkok's cosmopolitan urban jungle are the expert tailors that can be seen on almost every street. You can get a tailor-made suit together for just about a week or two at a very reasonable price. Despite the city's known busyness, Bangkok also offers experiences for rest and recluse. Massage parlors can be found all over Bangkok, offering a Thai oil massage, head, neck and back massage, foot massage, and many more. One can also opt for a nature respite from the sprawling concrete jungle nearby within the city. It is known for its lush tropical trees, lakes, and raised embankments that pass unique houses on stilts built along the Chao Phraya River's edge.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Rizkan Show for empowering conversation.
Sean, thank you so much for joining Al Arabiya. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So 1,000 days into this conflict, and the war in Ukraine has not been won. In your mind, what are the next steps?
Well, I think you almost have to step back a little bit from that and go, what is achievable now? For the last 2.5 years of the conflict, there's been a view, certainly from the Ukrainian view, we will get rid of Russia. We've been fighting them for 300 years. They've constantly been trying to destroy our language, our communities, our culture, our families. We will prevail, as we always do. But actually, on a visit back there 3 or 4 weeks back, there was much more of a sense of awareness. And that prospect of victory, if that is clearing out Russians from every corner of Ukraine, that seems to be fading fast. And actually, there does feel a much more of a palpable sense of how do we emerge from this with a positive story, positive narrative? How do we emerge from this with our security and our border secure of what remains? How do we rebuild our country? And how do we live, grow and live our life beyond this? Because it's a terrible price that's being paid at the moment. And it's very difficult to see how Ukraine can win in the conventional sense. It's also very difficult to see how Russia can win. And therefore, how do you bring this awful situation to an end? And that involves compromises which are uncomfortable to talk about, because all of them have horrible implications. But the bloodshed is just devastating, and on both sides. And that somehow is not sustainable.
How closely tied in your mind is this fatigue that you saw on the ground in Kyiv, for example, in Ukraine more broadly, to the election of Donald Trump in the United States?
One of the questions I asked when I was out there, I had a whole load of questions to ask people. I said, what do you feel about Donald Trump? And they were, of course, all awfully very polite, because they know how heavily dependent they are on American aid, particularly. But when you push them a bit, perhaps over a beer, one of the things they said, you do realise we've been fighting Russia for 300 years. Do you really think that one Western politician in 24 hours is going to solve this? And it was a really poignant moment. It felt like, as a Westerner, I was almost trying to impose my will on them, as it were. And it's plain that that's not going to be the answer. I think the trouble is there's lots of implications here. The Trump effect, as a bit of a student of history, if you look back when he came in on the first term, I'm going to build a continuous war with Mexico. Didn't quite manage that. I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East. Didn't quite do that. And I'm going to sort out that horrible little man from North Korea. Didn't do that either. But what it did do is a clear intent of where his focus was going to be. And therefore, it's pretty clear, although solving the war in 24 hours is clearly not possible, it's pretty clear where his intent is. Is it to continue supporting Ukraine until the end, or is it about trying to draw the war to an end in some way? What that looks like, probably only President Trump-elect actually knows what that looks like.
Less than 2 weeks from that historic election in the United States, and you have the G20 now reflecting in their statement less of a we must win, continuous and unfiltered or unadulterated support for Ukraine, and also, of course, a realization on the part of European governments that if they're going to do this, they're going to have to go it alone. And when they look at their budgets and their balance sheets, it's just not going to be possible.
No, and if you look at it from literally big picture stuff, the Europeans and the Americans are given about the same amount of money. But if you look at about military aid, the US provides far more because it's got far deeper pockets, it's got far bigger inventories, far bigger war stocks, and therefore it would be almost impossible for Europe to match. They could potentially dig deeper into their pockets, but it isn't the money that's required. It's manpower and weapons. And those weapons, you can't nip down to the local supermarket and buy them. They take ages to be built, and we've emptied our war stock of those weapons. I think what's interesting from geopolitical, though, again, people are very scared about the Trump effect. They've talked about him walking away from NATO, talked about... I think actually there are some things which I think we just, although at times the message...
Wasn't he the greatest thing to happen to NATO, though?
Well, in a way, that is my view, that, we had only a third of NATO members were paying their way. And that's not right. As a nation who also pays their way, we don't pay as much as America do, but America spends double the amount proportionally on defence and far more actually in purely quantums. But 2/3 of NATO weren't actually paying their way. Well, why should they enjoy the benefit of security? Since those Trump days, we've now got over 2/3 of NATO paying their way. Is that enough? No. But I do think so. Some of the Trump rhetoric is designed, I think, to say, look, America will look after China. Russia's right on your doorstep. You're feeling the heat there. Europe, step up and sort it out.
Yeah.
And in a way, we're seeing that with Poland, who've doubled their defence budgets. Most of Europe's sweating a little bit, going, if America's not going to sort this out, we need to. What does that look like? And I think that's created a really interesting dynamic in NATO. And it's a harsh reminder that 3 decades of sort of post-Cold War peace dividend are well and truly over.
We have a new Secretary General. He's coming from the Netherlands, Mark Rutte. It's a gentleman I've interviewed on a number of occasions. That's a country that hasn't been paying their 2%. There are questions, of course, about what kind of leadership he's going to bring to the organization. In your mind, does this leave, with the election of Donald Trump, perhaps a window for NATO to become even more cohesive?
I think it'll be a defining moment for NATO. I have to say, part of my scepticism is that if you measure military capability by mass, NATO is a resounding success. You add up all the tanks, add up all the aircraft, it's fantastic. The problem with a committee is that you can only move at the pace of the slowest. And I think we've already found with Ukraine, providing weapons for Ukraine has not been something that all nations agree with. The UK was the first to offer tanks. There was lots of reluctance to offer tanks. And the danger is that NATO, actually, when the UK was providing Storm Shadow, for example, long-range missiles, and America turned around and went, I think you probably don't want to do that until we've all agreed it. And as a result, Putin sat there watching, laughing. He lives in an autocracy where he makes a decision, it happens. Yeah. NATO has some huge benefits, but it's also demonstrating some significant challenges. And there is a view that what do we do if President Putin decides to have a go at Lithuania or Latvia? NATO members. But would NATO roundly sign up for a nuclear war based on going into those countries? Now, the obvious political answer is, of course they would. But I think Putin's already seeing, with his sabre rattling, which he's doing regularly, just how nervous the West is, just how nervous. And by forming an alternative to NATO, that sort of axis of evil, potentially North Korea, Iran, China, he's already starting to form an axis of body that's saying we can challenge the West, because they might look big and strong, but actually the glue that ties them together isn't that strong at all.
When you think about how this is all going to look 20 years from now, in your mind, did the West sell Ukraine a raw bill of goods in terms of what they were going to do, what they would be willing to do, and what they could afford to do in support of Ukraine?
So one of the questions I asked when I was out in Ukraine was about the West support. And what was fascinating, again, they were very polite initially, but their memory of the fall of the Soviet Union, their memory, I mean, if you remember, for the viewers particularly, Ukraine became the 3rd largest nuclear power in the world because the former Soviet Union had forward deployed its weapons into Ukrainian soil. So when the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had all these nuclear weapons. They didn't have the launch codes, but they had the weapons. And as a result, America, the UK, Russia sat down with Ukraine and said, look, it's not healthy for you to have those weapons. We'll guarantee your sovereignty, all of us, if you give up those nuclear weapons. So the Budapest Memo of 1994 was signed, and 20 years later, Putin rips it up and goes into Crimea. Now, where the Ukrainians remember that period is they were coerced, they were forced into signing that, and the only reason they agreed to sign it was because you, the West, guaranteed our security. When we called on that insurance policy, nobody was there.
We've shown them what that's worth.
And I think it's very easy, yes, to criticise Putin for what he did, but he went into Crimea, saw that the West didn't actually do anything, wrote a couple of stiff letters. Really? Is that really what the security guarantees of the Budapest Memo 94 were about? Now, I wasn't there, you weren't there, you know, but I do understand that it's one thing writing something, it's quite another actually doing something.
And that is part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, we've had technically 20 years to understand Vladimir Putin, to understand his red lines, how far he's willing to go. Most people called it wrong when, you know, the invasion happened. Nobody really thought that he would make that move because economically it didn't make sense. Why would you jeopardize your place in the world order? But he did it, and he did it anyway. And it looks as if now, in a sense, he's going to be able to walk away from this quite successfully, because the conversation now seems to be surrounding how do we end this and allow Russia to save face.
Yeah, that sticks in the throat a bit, doesn't it, about saving face. I think if you would be an idealist, and you know, when I was younger I was an idealist, now I'm much more of a pragmatist.
Now you're a grown-up.
You know, the idealist would say, no, you can't hand Russia a victory, because what will that mean? The flip side of that is that there is a view at the moment that Ukraine is locked into an attritional battle. It is the smaller party. An attritional battle, traditionally the smaller party loses. It's a bit like medieval times. We'll meet on the battlefield, have a cup of tea and then have a go at each other. The strongest and most numerous tend to win. Well, this attritional battle, unfortunately, is favouring Russia. They're on the front foot in the Donbass. They're on the front foot in the Kursk region. And therefore, if you continue fighting, one of the risks is that Russia actually makes a breakthrough, and all of a sudden it could be a lot more territory. It potentially could be an endgame for Ukraine completely. And therefore, rather than be an idealist and say, look, we're never going to stop until we win or we lose, is there some other very unpalatable, but some other solution? And I sensed from my visit, I sensed from a lot of the conversations I have, and I'm still connected to a lot of very well-informed parts of this landscape. And that sense of what does victory look like, they're fading in its hope rather than expectation. Whereas the expectation of we're running out of people, running out of ideas, and Trump's rhetoric may well just be the final nail in we've got to find an alternative way to draw this to a close. The question then is, how does that appease President Zelensky? Part of it is you've got to rebuild your country. Part of it is we're going to need some security guarantees, and I'm not going to accept a signature on a bit of paper. But also for Putin, how do you actually coerce Putin into signing something or agreeing something? You've got to have a sweetener. He's got all the aces at the moment. If you're going to stop, why stop? So, in a way, I wouldn't be at all surprised if one of the things that will be discussed behind closed doors is stopping some of the sanctions, returning his place. And that's distasteful, but if that is the price of bringing this conflict to an end, is that a price worth paying? And what are the implications of that for Xi Jinping looking at Taiwan?
Well, it's probably an unavoidable price, considering the fact that, you know, we're talking about budgets, we're talking about economies, we're talking about the U.S. government, who, under Donald Trump, will presumably not be willing to spend as much as they have spent. But interestingly enough, we've seen, obviously, the Biden administration making some last-minute pushes, last-ditch efforts, if you will, to continue their policies towards Ukraine. They've got a couple of months left, and even though he is a lame duck, technically, it doesn't seem as if that's keeping them from continuing to push their agenda. Does that leave perhaps some possibilities for Zelensky?
No. The last 48 hours has been fascinating, as we've talked about. Let's be specific. ATACMS, these army tactical missile systems, which are, you know, vaunted as the answer to the Maiden's Prayer. They're a supersonic missile. They go ballistic. They go 200 miles. The downside is they've only got a £500 charge in the middle of them. They cost well over $1 million each. And there's not many of them around.
Yeah.
So they're very effective at surgical strike, but Russia's already moving its fighter jets out of range of those, so they can't be used.
And this has devolved into a drone war as is.
Well, it's also, I think, the short. We tend to talk about drones as being short range. The debate about long-range weapons, that can the West give them, we're running out of them, can we allow them to use them into Russia, it's become a really convoluted conversation about something which, frankly, is not going to change the course of the war. What has been happening behind the scenes is that Ukraine has been saying, OK, we may not be able to give you these long-range weapons, but if we could give you all of the parts, sensors, rocket packs, explosives, and you assemble them, you can assemble something that's much more modern than we could give you. To the West to develop it would mean we'd have to do safety cases, we'd do lots of safety. You don't have to do any of that. And we've actually seen over the last couple of months Ukraine be a lot more effective at doing deep strikes into Russia.
Yes.
And so the danger is we get this argument seduced about, will the West provide? Actually, this is about, can Ukraine strike deep into Russia? And it is able to do that now. I think the very different question is that, you know, these ATACMS, I think, in a way, people say, is this Biden's last? No, it's a really modest step. I think the reason he's done it now, bluntly, is that in the Kursk region, Ukraine has a small enclave. It went in there in August. It's been pushed out of a third of that enclave. Putin will not want to negotiate whilst there's a Ukraine presence on Russian territory. He's going to do everything possible to get that cleared. He's got 50,000 troops up there, apparently 12,000 North Korean troops as well. He is going to be doing everything. Just imagine the instructions he's giving to his commanders. Don't come back until you've cleared that area.
Yes.
Massive casualties, and therefore what it appears that Biden's going is, we need to help you with that enclave. We're not giving you weapons that you can strike deep within Russia. We're giving you weapons that you can strike in Russia as part of protecting that enclave and supporting, holding out for as long as you can. I think that's far more logical than some knee-jerk against Trump, because, frankly, the day Trump comes in, he could sign an order saying, no, you can't use them anymore.
Yeah.
Simple.
And did President Biden undercut Europe?
By doing the by putting the weapons in early? I don't buy that. No, the trouble is, this whole weapons thing, I think, is a bit of a non-story. If you need help, I give you weapons. As long as you use them within the law of armed conflict, I shouldn't actually say, we can't do that with them, but you can do that with them.
But that's been the story of this entire conflict.
I know, but because that's been the story of the conflict, when you then take those restrictions away, you provide Putin with the opportunity to wail and shake the nuclear sabre. I mean, that's the irony of this whole thing, that ultimately there shouldn't have been a story about this. It should have been, here's the weapons, use them as you see fit. And the problem by having now is that if Keir Starmer now makes a thing with the media about suddenly, oh, we're green light on, I think it'll just happen under the radar. I think he'll just say, President Zelensky, you've got the weapons. Nobody's marking your homework and seeing what's happening. We're not going to make an announcement and play to Putin's game. We've always said you can use the weapons. Let's face it, Lord Cameron had originally said you can use those weapons as you see fit. They were reined in because of the US angle. So I don't think that by playing all this out in public, it doesn't help. And I suspect Keir Starmer, rather than going, yes, we're going to confront Putin, is just quietly going to Zelensky, carry on, use the weapons, don't break the law of armed conflict, and we'll continue to support you as best we can.
And so the market chatter that we've heard over the last 24 hours suggesting that this could push President Putin to use nuclear weapons, in your mind, if he was going to do that, he would have already done it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a regular talking about this stuff. I'm grey-haired. I served in the military when we were in the middle of the Cold War. We talked about nuclear weapons. We did nuclear fallout drills on our missions. We were planning one-way missions, never expecting to come back. You know, and then all of a sudden the peace dividend happened. Nobody talked. There's nobody around these days that has lived through that time. And the danger is, therefore, Putin knows it's a really effective, sabre to rattle that scares everybody. And it's worked. He keeps saying it, and we step back from the brink. Let's be absolutely clear. If we wanted to stop Russia from invading Ukraine, if we put a no-fly zone in there tomorrow, my colleagues in the air forces would love to have a go at that. Putin struggled against a really old, decrepit air force. Imagine if a 21st century air force to sweep in. He'd be stopped in a heartbeat. We don't want to do that. That's a choice we're making. So We could do it, we've just chosen not to.
Yeah, consistently. In your mind, post-war environment, when we talk about investment in Ukraine, there are investment vehicles at the ready. BlackRock and JP Morgan have one. The idea being, of course, that between the United States and the European Investment Bank, there's going to be billions of dollars worth of investment going into Ukraine. But, of course, that does have implications for insurance, for example, markets, and whether or not, this war is really coming to a close. Security guarantees. Given the lackadaisical way in which we have behaved towards the Ukrainians so far, what kind of security guarantees can they reasonably expect?
It's a great question. I think part of it is there's been a lot of talk about NATO providing it. I have to say it's quite difficult to see how NATO will be the answer. First of all, NATO isn't a club you just come and join. There's all sorts of things. It's a collective. You will have to contribute towards it in some way, militarily, financially, etc. And there's certain standards that I don't think Ukraine will meet for quite some time to come. Quite apart from the fact, you're now Putin, I'm now Zelensky, and we're negotiating an end. If I tell you I'm going to be part of NATO, Putin's going to go, unless that's off the table...
There's no conversation.
There's no conversation. So it's quite difficult to see how NATO is the answer. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer. There are bilateral, trilateral arrangements that can be made, military bases that are now forward deployed onto Ukrainian soil. There's lots of ways that could make it a lot more difficult for Putin to take a breather for a few years and then start again. Because if he had an American base, a French base, a UK base near the front line of the new border, in whatever that was, that would put a very different dynamic in to the Putin's mind if he thought he was going to take another chunk out of Ukraine anytime soon. So I think there are other ways of providing that security guarantee. I think the financial one is really interesting because at the end of the Second World War, obviously Germany was devastated. That became the powerhouse of Europe.
Yes.
So there is the potential.
Until now.
But there is the potential for Ukraine to be rebuilt and modernised, and this could be the foundations of a brave new future for Ukraine that has had a very difficult 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. A land of opportunity, maybe.
What is your assessment of the sort of European response post-election in the United States? And I'm speaking specifically about the call between Olaf Scholz and Vladimir Putin and the reaction from other European leaders. Outrage from Zelensky, but outrage from Emmanuel Macron as well.
Europe's in a slightly difficult position, isn't it? I think.
Well, it's a tough one when the French are the ones that are pushing back the most, right? And being less willing to negotiate.
The trouble is, I mean, at its heart, President Trump says it's America first. Actually, that sounds very provocative, but the reality is every country operates with its own national interest at first. Every country.
Yes.
And so not every country will feel the same heat from Russia. There is a view, I mean, let's face it, most of our countries are suffering a bit of a COVID hangover financially at the moment. Therefore, there's a lot of demand for money internally as well as externally. Now, one argument you could say, Russia's a threat, we have to ramp up our defence spending. When I was in the Ministry of Defence, the two driving threats that drove how much money we spent were Russia and China. Russia has now spent itself. It's lost most of its main battle tanks. It is no longer the threat from an equipment perspective that it was before. Worse than that, we were a little bit scared of it. Now we've seen how inept it is and how poor both the equipment is and also how it operates.
But they are rebuilding and reindustrializing
how long
around
will it take
the military
to make that
economy.
Happen, though?
Even if it's years. Even if it's years, they're up against what we now see is a Europe that is significantly degraded in terms of its economic power.
Yes, but I think if you do the harsh metrics, the West, even without America, is still far overmatches what Russia has. And it's not just in quantity, it's also in quality. Now, does that mean, would we want to take on Russia because of the nuclear threat? Absolutely not. But it does mean that Russia would have to think twice. It was expecting to walk into Ukraine and over a matter of days take Ukraine. 1,000 days later, it is still suffering huge casualties, lost so much equipment. It is not a very potent military machine. And if President Putin had his time again, I wonder whether he'd play his cards quite the same. We were talking earlier that one of the challenges is it's very difficult to know what his motivation is here. Is it because he wants a big stone statue of himself in the Great Hall, like Peter the Great, that he's been part of rebuilding the Russian Empire? He said he wanted to make Russia great again. It's been a bit of a pariah on the world stage. He said he wanted to stop the expansion of NATO. NATO's expanded as a result of it, and Putin himself found himself indicted by the International Criminal Court. It doesn't feel like a very positive outcome, but if he secures that land bridge, the Donbass and Crimea, despite the casualties, he may gloss over that and declare victory. But I think the oligarchs and everybody who actually provides the power base will be going, you paid a massive price for that. We don't want to do that again, do we?
In your mind, what is the best way to position President Zelensky going into these negotiations?
Well, incredibly difficult, because it doesn't matter how you spin it, Ukraine is on the back foot. They are struggling. They've been heavily reliant on international support. That international support is waning. It's not waxing at the moment. The coffers are basically bare, and the defence industrial base of Russia is still ramping up tremendously. They've got oil revenues paying for it all. So it doesn't look like a winning hand. Therefore, how do you create the circumstances where you end up with some form of peace? Now, I'm not entirely convinced that Putin will want to have that conversation. He certainly won't want to be bullied into it, and unless he feels he's won. So I think the answer is less about what Zelensky can stomach. It's more about what will need to be on the table for Putin to consider that actually it's worth his while stopping.
As this war winds down, in your mind, does this help or hurt President Zelensky at home? Are we going to have a Churchill effect post-1945?
I think it's very likely. And I was quite... So one of the questions I was asking when I was out in Ukraine, and it's not a big... I can't speak for the whole of Ukraine, but I thought I would go out and ask, what do they think of President Zelensky? And I was asking loads of people, barmen, all sorts. And I thought they'd all be resoundingly for him. And they looked at me quizzically, and I said, well, from outside, I know nothing about the politics, but this man has cometh the hour, cometh the man. He has stepped up, he's galvanised support internationally. And all of them just went, yeah, he's done that, but he doesn't get my vote.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't be drawn on it. And so it is only a tiny dip test, but most wartime leaders struggle over time. That if he's a signal of the resilience of Ukraine, that's great.
Yes.
If he translates to being stubborn, when actually the mood of the country is, I've had enough. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying it's a really difficult time. And it may be I just spoke to the wrong people in Kyiv, but I very much sense he has done a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances. Whether he endures beyond this is a very different question.
Yeah. John, it's great to have you on Al Arabiya. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up in this special edition of the programme, we take a look back at some of the highlights of the last few weeks. Welcome to the programme. The Russian President Vladimir Putin does not seem to be letting President Biden's approval of Ukraine's use of US long-range missiles go unanswered. In response, he has approved changes to Russia's nuclear doctrine, now stating that an attack from a non-nuclear state, if backed by a nuclear power, will be treated as a joint assault on Russia. Well, the updated doctrine proposed last September was ratified today on what was the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine. Well, Washington has been accused by Russia of escalating the war in Ukraine, or as the Kremlin puts it, adding fuel to the fire. Well, all this comes after President Biden authorized Ukraine to use US-made missiles, allowing it to strike deep into Russian territory for the first time. Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to Philip Breedlove, who is a retired four-star general who served as the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again, General Breedlove. Great to have you with us. I'd like to put to you this new development that we're following here at Al Arabiya. Russia says that Ukraine has fired these US-supplied long-range missiles into Russian territory. And this, of course, just the day after President Zelensky was given permission by the Biden administration to do so. What are your thoughts at this stage?
Well, I am thankful that our government has changed its policy. This is a change we should have made years ago. Russia has been firing into Ukraine from the Belarus airspace, Russian airspace, Black Sea airspace. They have been using missiles from at least 2 other countries and missile parts from China to develop their own missiles to fire into Ukraine. And so we in the West have, in that same time, forbidden Ukraine from using any of our equipment to return fire. It was an absurd policy when it was first made, and hopefully now we are past that point.
I mean, if this is confirmed, do you find it surprising that the Ukrainians were so quick to use this new weaponry?
No, I mean, there have been targets that were appropriate for this kind of missile for months and years. This is a capability that we should have given Ukraine a long time ago. And so they've had a developed target list, and it does not surprise me that they would fire quickly. Remember that in the last 3 or 4 days, Ukraine has come under intense attack by Russia. Russia has increased its ferocity in this attack. Some say it's sort of an answer to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump told them not to accelerate the war, and Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war since he's been told not to. And so as Russia does accelerate this war, just the other night they fired over 210 long-range weapons into Ukraine. Since they have stepped it up, then Mr. Zelensky has replied.
Okay, so of course Ukraine has now confirmed that it's used these ATACMS, and we've heard Russia reacting to this, saying this signals a new phase of, quote, Western war. I'm just wondering what you see as being possible next steps by Russia.
Well, Russia's throwing everything they have at Ukraine right now. I'm not sure that there is more left for them to accelerate with. Of course, the Western world is fearful they might use a nuclear weapon. This is what Mr. Putin wants the West to believe. His army has failed him in many ways. His air force has failed him in many ways. His Black Sea fleet has been defeated in the northern Black Sea. What works extremely well for Mr. Putin is his war of intimidation. He continues to threaten the West on almost a daily basis about things that the West told him they were fearful of. Nuclear exchange and or a widening of the war. And these are the things that Mr. Putin talks about all the time. What has he done in the last 2 days? He says he signed a new document which changes their nuclear doctrine. This is the way Mr. Putin replies to challenges from the West. He steps up his rhetoric, he steps up his intimidation, and he expects the West to back down.
You don't sound very concerned. I mean, the European top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has said that Russia is irresponsible for using this kind of rhetoric. But how can we be so sure it's just that? It's only rhetoric. How can we be sure that Russia...
I don't think I've said this morning that it's just rhetoric. I just said this is what he uses. We have to be academically honest that he might use some of these weapons. I mean, in our past, we faced similar, if not worse, crises in America, and our President Kennedy stood up to it, and he solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then in the intermediate nuclear range missile crisis, Mr. Reagan stood up to it, and he solved that crisis. And so we now are in a similar situation to those two. And academically, they both faced real reactions by Russia. And we do face real reactions by Russia. But what we do know for sure is that every time Mr. Putin threatens us, we back up, then we know exactly what the results are. We will be backing up. At some point, the West has to take a look at this threat and take a different action, I think. Just one more point. In 2008, the reply of the West to the invasion and occupation of Georgia was inadequate. We gave great gift to Russia in that they kept 20% of Georgia. We rewarded bad behavior. Then in 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine. The West's reply was once again inadequate to task, and we rewarded Russian behavior by allowing them to keep portions of Ukraine. And now in 2024, we are faced with a similar situation. Will we once again reward bad behavior, or will we make a change in Western policy?
Well, that remains to be seen, doesn't it, with the new administration coming to power in 2 months from now in D.C. I mean, what do you see the Trump administration bringing to the table with regards to relations with Moscow and with regards specifically to this conflict with Ukraine?
Well, I think that we clearly will have some, as the naval officers say, a sea change in the way this is approached. Mr. Trump, President-elect Trump, former President Trump, has said that he wants to end this war quickly, and I believe it. I think he wants to find an end to this war quickly. I think that at this point, as you've seen many pundits writing, Mr. Putin sees that and sees that he thinks he has the upper hand because he believes Mr. Trump needs a quick end. And so this is going to end up in an interesting negotiation. Mr. Trump has already told Mr. Putin not to accelerate this war. Mr. Putin has chosen to accelerate the war in answer to Mr. Trump's demands. And so I think the conversation has already started.
I just want to pick up on something you were saying a moment ago, recalling the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Of course, that's the closest, isn't it, that the world has come that we know of to proper, full-blown international nuclear warfare. Do you think this is the next most dangerous point that we've come to in history, to full-blown nuclear war?
I'm not sure I would categorize it as that. Again, we had the intermediate range nuclear missile crisis of the Cold War that President Reagan handled. I think that what I would say is that if the West always backs up, we will get closer and closer to nuclear war. A famous Russian thinker once tells a story of, as you approach your enemy, fix your bayonet and press your bayonet into the enemy's belly. And if it is soft, push further and harder. If the belly is hard, step back and reconsider your options. And so right now, in 08, in 14, our belly was soft, and Mr. Putin is pushing further and harder. We have a choice to make in 2024.
Today is, of course, the 1,000th day of this war in Ukraine. Winter is approaching, and I expect you, like lots of military experts, have been following the conflict very closely these last 3 years. What typically happens at this time of year, or perhaps what typically doesn't happen at this time of year? Perhaps I should rephrase the question, because isn't it a time when people's positions get sort of entrenched, the ground turns extremely hard? Can we expect much to happen on the ground in the next couple of months?
Well, I'm not being rude, but let me correct you. This war is 10 years old. It started in the early winter of 2014 when I was the commander of NATO. And it has been going for 10 years. It's been hot for the first couple of years. Then it went warm as the line in the Donbass settled for some number of years. And now we're almost 1,000 days into the latest part of this 10-year-long war. So to the second part of your question, repeat it, please.
I was just wondering what typically happens at this time of year, given that the ground is so hard.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So lots of things happen due to the weather. We go through a really muddy period where the ground is untrafficable for large armored formations. Then we get to a frozen hard period where armored vehicles can once again move, but it's really hard to move an army. And so then in the spring, we'll go back through another intensely muddy period where there's no trafficability for for heavy weapons for a while. So the tactics of the battlefield seem to settle down. And what happens typically for Russia is they intensify their attack against the Ukrainian people. As you watch how Russia has bombed Ukraine over the last 10 years, and certainly over the last 1,000 days, Russia's attack is almost uniquely towards the Russian or to the Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, all the things that get Ukraine through a cold winter. This is what Russia is attacking. They've proved rather unable to put an intense attack against the Ukrainian forces, so they focus on the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian civil infrastructure.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again. General Philip Breedlove, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the US President-elect Donald Trump has said he is willing to make use of the military to deport migrants in large numbers. While taking to social media, he indicated that he would declare an emergency and use military assets to carry out mass deportations. Well, the issue of immigration has become an increasingly important issue and a leading cause for concern, dissent and debate within the United States. Let's take a look at some numbers for you. The US is home to 1/5 of the world's international immigrants. About 11 million undocumented immigrants live in the United States, making up 3% of the country's population. Well, as of 2022, unauthorized immigrants made up 23% of US foreign-born population in 2022, higher than when Trump was president back in 2019. Well, the president-elect built his campaign on the foundations of immigration reform, repeatedly promising his supporters to mobilize the National Guard and aid the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, known as ICE, to carry out deportations. Well, for more, we're joined now by Ronald Vitiello, a former ICE director who was also the chief of Border Patrol during the last Trump administration. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. The incoming Trump administration says it's going to declare a national emergency and use the military to carry out these mass deportations. Is this really a national emergency?
Well, we've just gone through a crisis about the last 4 years. With unprecedented illegal entries at the southwest border. At the peak, 10,000 people a day were crossing the border illegally. The government itself, the DHS itself, has said that 85% of those people have been released into the country, so they now live amongst us in every city and town in America. We're also faced with a terrible opioid crisis across the country in which hundreds of thousands in the last 2 years of Americans have died or been poisoned by this deadly fentanyl. So it has been an emergency for the last 3+ years. And so a correction needs to occur. I support the president's idea that we need to fix the border, stop the leak, and stop the chaos at the immediate border, at the southwest border, but then repair and fix the security situation in the rest of the country. And that will require more than the organic assets that ICE and the DHS have at their disposal now.
So who should be most concerned about this development? Who's at the top of the list for deportation?
Well, the president has been very clear that the criminals and threats to public safety would be at the top of the list for targeted enforcement, immigration enforcement in cities and towns all over the United States. So those with convictions, those who are wanted in other countries, those who have run afoul of the law in the United States, the worst are going to go first.
How many will we be talking in that case?
I've seen open source reporting in the press that there's 8+ million people on what the government calls the non-detained docket. That's 8 million people who are in the country and they have no status and they need to see an immigration judge. Some of them have already been ordered removed. And in that ordered removed category, there are 1.5 million people who have some sort of criminal involvement or a criminal record. They're either wanted somewhere or they've committed crimes that make them ineligible to get relief from an immigration judge in the United States. So at minimum, there's 1.5 million people who are in the country illegally and have also committed crimes in the communities and towns that they live in.
Okay, according to the American Immigration Council, deporting 1 million people would cost more than $960 billion over the period of a decade. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. Is it worth it?
Well, there's been times in the history of the United States. I heard yesterday that when Barack Obama was president, he managed to deport almost 4 million people in his first term. And so, yeah, I mean, it involves logistics, it involves employees, it involves salaries, it involves detention, it involves airplane flights to repatriate people and take them back home. And so, yeah, it's expensive, but it also minimizes the impact all over the country of lowering wages, of our school systems that are overburdened, our cities and towns that don't have enough properties to rent. So there is a net benefit in the security of the United States, first and foremost. And then it helps in some of these other areas as well. And so, yes, it might be expensive, but you are paying for national security along with border security.
Let's talk about this mass deportation program. It's supposed to begin on the first day of the new Trump presidency, but can it really get started on day one? Because, of course, there's due process, isn't there, for each case to be considered really on a case-by-case basis?
Well, all operations of the government require a will from the commander-in-chief to support the front line. Right now, as we speak today, in many of the large cities in the United States, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement removal officers, are out looking for the worst of the worst. They're looking for people who have run afoul of the law in their own community and are also in the country illegally. And so they can take the handcuffs off. They can prioritize those activities while a plan is being written, while a plan is being coordinated, while the logistics are put in place to scale up their work. There's about 150 of those officers in the United States, but there's nearly 20,000 immigration officers in ICE. And so you can reallocate the existing resources in ICE, perhaps get some help from the Department of Defense, and use the state and local cooperation agreements that exist today and enhance and improve those along the way. So starting day one, they can prioritize this activity and add resources as the plans are written and operationalized.
Okay, but I mean, obviously there are going to be legal challenges, and that's going to hold the process up because obviously due process can't be completely disregarded. But then not just legal challenges, there's also going to be logistical challenges. I mean, there's talk of large-scale detention camps being built, tents being built. I mean, all that's going to take a huge amount of time, isn't it?
Well, there will be a time factor into when they can get it to scale. But as it relates to the legal factors, that 1.5 million criminally involved aliens are in the country, and many of them have already been ordered deported by a judge. They are already on the path for removal. They're just not in government custody to go ahead and repatriate them back home. And so the law is very clear. It's against the law to cross the border illegally without being inspected and stay in the United States. It's also against the law to work while you're illegally in the United States or to be hired by an employer. Employers can be fined for similar things. And so the legal footing that the president will stand on for targeted enforcement against the worst of the worst, and then scale up to the 20 plus million people that are in the country illegally. The law is very clear on status there. And there is a due process element. And I would just say in the last 3.5 years, the government has spent billions of dollars in caring for people who are in custody when they rush the border for the last 3.5 years. There are facilities, there are about 8 facilities across the U.S.-Mexico border on the U.S. side that temporarily hold people before they're released in the United States. One of those large facilities in the El Paso area cost $1 billion a year to run. And so we're already spending enormous amounts of money for the flow that is occurring today. If you stop the leak and repurpose those facilities, you could scale this up fairly quickly.
But I mean, talking about cost again, I mean, the costs, really go into the stratosphere at a certain point, because we've talked about the cost of deporting 1 million people, and that would be somewhere in the region of $960 billion. Donald Trump says there are between 15 and 20 million people who could be drawn up on a list for deportation. I mean, just doing the maths, I mean, even if it's 10 million, which is what Pew Research says it is, the number of people who could be deported, we're talking about $10 trillion US. I mean, does the United States even have that kind of money? Because last time I checked, it's about 1/3 of national debt.
It's going to be expensive. They're going to require resources. But I will just tell you that when we had the largest surge at the border of its time in 2014, when Barack Obama was the president, again, they were deporting hundreds of thousands of people every single day. When he asked career people like me to fix the problems at the southwest border, we put a number of steps in place to deter people from leaving home and trying to come into the United States, because we ended the incentives. If you end the incentive to be in the United States illegally, many people will elect to go home by themselves. You'll remember that when Donald Trump became the president in 2018, there was a mass exodus from the United States into Canada of people who were illegally in the country and were fearful of being deported and removed by the U.S. government, and they fled to Canada. So some people will elect to go home to stay out of immigration detention, to stay out of the logistics chain, the pipeline, to be returned home. And so it's not just government agencies going out and putting hands on every single of the 20 million people that have come into the United States in the last several years. It will also be able to verify departures of people who wish not to stay under the conditions in which they can't find a job, that if they get arrested by local authorities, they're going to be immediately referred to ICE for removal, and then a concentrated effort to find the worst of the worst across the United States.
But we're talking about some people who, for example, like the Dreamers, who came to the United States as children. I'm just wondering whether they'd be concerned by sweeping deportations, and whether the DACA legislation brought in by the Obama administration, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, whether that would be scrapped. What's your understanding of what would happen to those people?
Well, DACA is not law in the United States. It was a function of the executive branch. The president authorized the Department of Homeland Security to defer deportations for people that fell in that certain category. The Supreme Court has ruled that action to be illegal. Trump tried to end it in his first term. He tried to end the program and enrollments in the program in his first term. It was pushed back by the courts, and the courts didn't weigh that case on the merits. So it's not immigration law. But if we're starting with the worst of the worst and we're prioritizing the existing assets that DHS has now to focus on threats to public safety, it'll be a long time before we get to a place where somebody that's been in the country for over a decade will be on a path for removal.
And just lastly, tell us a bit about how you envisage your role being in the new Trump administration. And by extension of that, do you envisage more sections of border wall being built during Trump 2.0?
Well, I'm not a government employee now, but yes, I think that there are some unfinished portions of the border in which material and contracts were let to build a border wall that will be reinstated. We've learned a lot over the last 3.5 years when the U.S. government sued Arizona and Texas for trying to protect their own borders. And so some of the infrastructure and some of the lessons learned in those will be applied to a new regime for infrastructure on the border. So I expect that the men and women of the Border Patrol are going to have the kind of support that they've not had in the last administration, the Biden administration, and will return to someone in the Oval Office that knows what they do and wants to give them the tools that they have to succeed.
Okay, Ron Vitello, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
Well, Lebanon's presidency is reserved for a Maronite Catholic, the premiership for a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of Parliament for a Shia Muslim. Well, in the absence of a president, authority rests with the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Well, to discuss the potential end to Lebanon's political paralysis, we can cross to Beirut and speak now to Ghassan Hasbani, who is the former Lebanese Deputy Prime Minister and Public Health Minister. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, sir. You're currently MP for the Strong Republic bloc in the Lebanese Parliament. Your country, of course, has been without a president, as we've been saying, for more than 2 years. It's now been announced that this special session of Parliament will be held on the 9th of January to elect a new president. How significant do you regard this development as being?
Well, it's quite an important development because we have been asking for this session for more than 2 years. And we would hope that this session would actually be a full constitutional session. What does that mean? Because all the previous sessions were held as a single session, whereby the first round requires a supermajority of 86 votes for anyone to be elected president, while the second round would require only 64 plus 1 votes. But we never got to the second round. The Speaker, parliamentary bloc, and his allies, Hezbollah, have always walked out of the room, leaving the session without quorum in the second round. And we had multiple first rounds that have been called for, and this is why we never were able to get a president democratically elected in more than 2 years. So we're hoping that this would be a significant step and that they would stay in the room for a second or third round until we elect a suitable president to lead the country in the next phase.
Okay, so who is that suitable president? Are there some candidates that you can see everyone rallying behind at this stage?
There are candidates that could rally people behind them. Some names are known, other names are still kind of in the development. We need somebody, more importantly than the name, we need somebody who can, first of all, this is a presidency for 6 years, not just for 1 year. So we need somebody who can establish stability and work with the Lebanese armed forces to implement the ceasefire and any further agreements and international UN resolutions fully and properly, because we cannot go back to what we were before the war. Secondly, a president capable of rallying the Lebanese people around a vision, around the constitution, able to rebuild the state system and rally people around the state, and at the same time be able to lead the country out of its economic downturn that we've been living through for more than 4 or 5 years now.
Okay, so given what you've just described as being the profile of the perfect candidate and the circumstances in which Lebanon finds itself, would you say that the right person would be more likely to be a career politician, or do you think a technocrat would probably be the right person for this kind of a job?
Well, it's going to be a complex job. Definitely the right person is somebody who values the Constitution and would implement his oath on protecting and implementing the Constitution, somebody who understands the public sector workings because they need to hit the ground running, somebody who is respected internationally as well, because there's going to be a lot of engagement with the international community for the recovery, and someone who can at the same time understand the economic issues and be able to lead the recovery plan together with the Prime Minister. So yes, there's going to be a technical background, a technocratic background, as well as somebody who understands also the workings of Lebanese politics. They could not just be parachuted into this position, and Lebanese public administration. All of these are criteria and important traits. However, more importantly, someone who's a sovereignist, who believes in the finality of the Lebanese state as it stands today on 10,452 square kilometers, somebody who would also uphold the constitution and be able to declare that and implement the fact in the constitution that no one carries arms but the Lebanese sovereign armed forces. And this is a starting point.
Okay, and I noticed you used the word his on one occasion there. It doesn't sound like you think there are any women candidates waiting in the wings.
At this point in time, I don't think there are any women candidates who have a serious chance of getting there, although we would hope that there will be more candidates coming forward with these qualifications and these commitments publicly made. We have asked, at least our bloc, that the next president should be clear about his or her position, but most likely it's going to be his, because this is where most of the candidates are. But if it is a her, that would be great. Position with respect to the implementation of UN resolutions. Now that we have a ceasefire agreement that enforces the implementation of UN Resolution 1701 and all the preceding resolutions, we do need a president that actually believes in that and capable of following it through.
Okay, and given, we're talking about a date of the 6th of January by which time a president might be agreed on. I mean, the situation Lebanon is in is extremely critical, and given these critical times, don't you think an emergency measure could be put in place so that this is done sooner? I mean, rather than waiting for another 6 weeks when the country needs leadership.
Absolutely. This is what we've been calling for. In fact, we called for it to be done 2 years ago. And throughout, we proposed candidates. We went to every single session and voted for a candidate. And we kept asking for a session to be held continuously, non-stop. So yeah, we do hope if it happens, we would like it to happen today before tomorrow. But that's what the speaker decided on. We don't know the reasons behind that. He surprised us this morning. At least better late than never.
Okay, I mean, obviously the people of Lebanon have been through absolute hell the last 2 months or so. Aside from installing a new president, I mean, what do you think are the other main priorities for Lebanon's political class to ensure that Lebanon's 5 million people get the future that they deserve?
First of all, definitely forming a government, nominating a prime minister, forming a government very quickly, a government capable of managing and conducting all the reforms and the tough measures required for the reforms, instilling stability and ensuring stability on the military side so that no weapons will be present outside the sovereign armed forces and the authorized security forces. So basically this would be a dismantling of all armed militias, infrastructure, and recovery of any existing weapons across Lebanese territory. Thirdly, the priority would be to safeguard the borders and Lebanese territory across all land, making sure that all borders are properly controlled, and to embark on a recovery plan for the country, economic recovery, social recovery, and a complete overhaul and restructuring of the public sector, reducing its size, corporatizing certain state-owned assets to improve their performance, and addressing the financial services sector problems and dealing with the depositors' money who are still waiting for the fate of their deposits after the crisis, then putting together and launching a full recovery initiative for the economy and fiscal policy.
Okay, so clearly lots needs to be done. I mean, one other thing that I'm wondering how you think this is going to be done. I mean, Hezbollah obviously isn't going anywhere. how do you think Lebanon decouples itself from Hezbollah and its grip on power and their apparent ability to hold the whole country hostage?
Well, we can't assume that Hezbollah is not going anywhere. Hezbollah is gone. Hezbollah, as we know it, as we have known it for 40 years, is no longer. Now we have a new set of options for Hezbollah. They either continue trying to rearm and fail in that and go against the international will and the most of the Lebanese will, or they accept the fact that they can be part of a democracy like all other political parties and become a political party to play the role that is given to them by whoever wants to support them. And this is their right as a political party. But they need to be under the umbrella of the state, like everybody else, on an equal playing field. So this is not about decoupling. This country has tried to decouple itself from a paramilitary force that has existed for 40 years, and it hasn't happened. And this impossibility of decoupling led to the country collapsing economically and then collapsing militarily and socially, with billions of dollars in losses, more than $10 billion in this war, 45,000 houses destroyed, 100,000 damaged, more than 12,000 injured and 4,000 killed. All of this is the cost of having this failure of decoupling or trying to decouple Hezbollah from the government without any results. Now, what happened has happened. Devastation has happened in Lebanon, but we should not let this go without any plan or any action to fix the situation for the future and never go back to the point we were at before the war.
Do you think Hezbollah is going to buy into that and play ball?
No, I don't think so. But this is not probably going to become a choice at some point in time. It's going to be a global will imposed on the situation. And most of the Lebanese want to move forward. The international community has put its weight to guarantee that, and we hope they act on it. The war, unfortunately, that nobody wanted and we had warned against many, many times before and called upon Hezbollah not to engage into a regional war, and they never listened. This war should not return. We hope it does not return. But it does seem that if Hezbollah is not compliant, this war might return and might go on. Lebanon has been given a chance by the sponsorship of the United States, France, and many other countries, and Arab countries as well. But this chance may be lost if Hezbollah keeps insisting on continuing the fight. The ceasefire decision or agreement is quite clear about the dismantling of all paramilitary infrastructure or military infrastructure outside the Lebanese armed forces, to disengage from any military acts and to collect any existing weapons and to prevent new weapons from entering the country or being manufactured in the country. The text is crystal clear, clearer than any UN resolution that we have seen so far. It is basically a practical and on-the-ground implementation and interpretation of all UN resolutions 1701, 1559, 1608, and others that have been written over many, many years.
I just want to ask you lastly, in a piece that was published on Al Arabiya's website by Makram Rabah, who is an assistant professor at AUB, perhaps you're familiar with his work, he said that the ceasefire deal was, quote, nothing short of a total capitulation to Israel's demands. Obviously, this deal was agreed to under duress by Lebanon. Do you think it was a good deal?
It depends on how you look at it, because a good deal would have been to implement 1701 and 1559 earlier this year before the war happened. We would have avoided a war, we would have avoided all the losses that I mentioned, and we would have actually had stability in the country, reaching a very honorable point where we are in harmony with UN resolutions and the international community and bringing back Lebanon to the place it should be in. The failure of implementing those resolutions and the refusal of Hezbollah to comply with those resolutions led us to doing this under fire. Unfortunately, no one can agree with having a war or putting this duress on the implementation. But again, the point of view of many neighboring countries now is shifting towards a more stable Middle East, and we need to be part of this more stable Middle East and stop the donkey shot approach to instability. So under duress or not, this is reality, and this has been the result of the war. The destruction that has happened to Lebanon led to this final decision, to which Hezbollah has actually agreed, and the Lebanese government has agreed. And if they do not wish to implement, then they will put us all back, all the Lebanese back, into a war situation.
And just before we say goodbye, I just want to ask you, Mr. Hasbani, on a personal note, how it feels to wake up every morning, as you have done for the last 2 mornings now, without the sound of drones, without the sound of planes, without the sound of shelling. How does that feel?
It feels very good. This is the country we want to live in. This is the country we want to have permanently. But it also is worrying because it is very fragile, this stability. It's, we're cautious all the time. In fact, we did have certain bombings in the south already. So effectively, we don't feel yet that the war is really over. It really depends on how seriously Hezbollah takes this agreement in terms of implementation.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Aslan Hasbani, thank you so much. So Lebanon has entered its second day of a ceasefire, but concerns remain with reports indicating a potential breach on both sides. The IDF states that it has detained 4 Hezbollah members who approached Israeli troops in southern Lebanon. They also reported firing on several individuals they described as suspects, this in Mace al-Jabal. Meanwhile, the Lebanese news agency reported that 2 people had been injured in Israeli shelling in the Nabatea governorate. Well, despite Israeli warnings against movement beyond the Litani River, displaced Lebanese civilians are returning south, with some heading to villages where Israeli troops are still deployed. Well, let's cross back to Beirut now, and we can speak to Khalil Hello, who is a retired general in the Lebanese army. General Hello, it's great to have you back with us on Al Arabiya News.
Thank you.
In your opinion, is the third Israeli-Lebanese war really over, or is this merely a 60-day pause?
No, it's not over at all. And I remind everybody that the first war between Hezbollah and Israel occurred in 1993, the second one in 1996. Then we had the Israeli withdrawal in 2000, and then in 2006. And this is the 5th time we speak about a truce or a ceasefire. So as far as the ingredients of any war are still there, I mean, the Hezbollah armed branch and the Palestinian conflict, as far as these ingredients are there, and as far as Iran involves itself in Lebanon, I think that this truce will be fragile. And the first elements of this fragility, we saw them today and yesterday. Israel fired on what it considered a movement that are a breach to the ceasefire, where they said Hezbollah elements were moving south, or that Hezbollah elements were manipulating missiles, short-range missiles. So they targeted them. And yesterday, the Hezbollah speech in Lebanon by Hezbollah MP and Hezbollah ministers are of a concern, because we understood that they don't want to withdraw their weaponry from south of the Litani, and they were questioning about the efficiency of the deployment of the Lebanese army south. So all this raises concern that this is a truce that saw the light under pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, first of all by the delay of the delivery of some important ammunition from the United States, because when this truce was announced, the U.S. announced that they will deliver for $620 million of ammunition to Israel. And the second thing is the arrest warrant against Netanyahu issued by the International Court that France said we give immunity to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think that there was a bargain behind this truce. And when things are this way, I don't think it is serious. We may believe that this is a true ceasefire once for all when Hezbollah complies with the International Security Council Resolution 1701, 1558, and accept to give their weaponry to the Lebanese army according to this resolution. And when we find that Hezbollah complied, first of all, with the resolution 1701 without any pressure, then we can believe, then we may believe that this will be a real ceasefire and a real stability.
Yeah, I mean, General Hello, do you think they're likely to do that, Hezbollah, and or do you think they're just going to use these 60 days to regroup and rebuild? And how is the Lebanese army going to play a part to make sure they don't do that?
Okay, now Hezbollah needed desperately this ceasefire, because their strategy, number one, is to spare what remains of their military power. And their military power has been seriously degraded by Israel during 14 months of bombardment. And the second strategy of Hezbollah is to keep its strength and assertiveness in the Lebanese interior affairs. So Hezbollah during these 60 days will reorganize for sure, will try to rearm, but this is unlikely because Syria is the pathway to this rearmament, and it is now, it has been bombarded heavily by Israel, and even United States Air Force targeted some Iranian fractions in Syria that tried to fire on the US bases there. And today we have a huge battle in northern Syria where we are hearing about incursion of Turkish tanks toward Aleppo. So all these events converge toward one thing. It's a warning to the Syrian regime to stop funneling weaponry to Hezbollah. So Hezbollah will try to regroup, to reorganize. And unfortunately, I cannot tell about the Lebanese army because the Lebanese army received instructions to go South Lebanon and to start deploying there. And it effectively started deploying in the region of Marjayoun. But the government orders to the Lebanese army are not very clear. So I'm wondering if the Lebanese army encounters Hezbollah weaponry or try to seize it or to confiscate it, what may happen? So this is a real concern that I cannot predict for the time being. We better wait for the future days in order to have a better assessment of the situation.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you, because it's quite confusing for people outside Lebanon to understand this, and it's really important. So we've got these 10,000 Lebanese army troops deployed to the south. If they see Hezbollah violating the terms of the truce, you're saying that the army doesn't really know how they're supposed to respond?
Yes. In principle, the army should seize all the weaponry and should kick out Hezbollah elements north to the Litani. But the attitude of the ministers of Hezbollah yesterday in the government, because, you know, our army follow the government. Our army is not a political independent institution. It is a tool in the hands of the Lebanese government that is vague regarding the implementation of the 1701. The prime minister and all the other ministers, they say they want to implement it. But the ministers of Hezbollah are taking a vague attitude toward this. So this is why I think that the Lebanese army should be very tough, should confiscate any weaponry south of the Litani in order to comply with the international resolution and to have the backing of the international community. So this is the main point. This is what should be done. But let's wait for the future days, for the next couple of days, to have the first tests about that.
OK, so, I mean, it's not just the Lebanese army, is it? There's UNIFIL is there, and we've got the so-called tripartite mechanism, which is the US, France and UNIFIL working together, plus the Lebanese army. They're all tasks with, they've got the same goal, which is to make the south of Lebanon safe, to make sure it doesn't pose a threat to neighbouring Israel, to make sure there aren't any violations, and to make sure that Hezbollah doesn't drag Lebanon into another war. Together, do you think they can do it?
Well, UNIFIL is in Lebanon under Chapter 6 of the UN. It is not a combat mission of UNIFIL. It's an observation mission. And the US and French observers that would help are not yet on the ground, I suppose. And these are only observers. These constitute an umbrella for the Lebanese army, an international umbrella to act in order to restore the Lebanese sovereignty in South Lebanon. All these are positive elements and are subjects of hope. But I still put a question mark on what will Hezbollah do. If Hezbollah is really in this government, and if Hezbollah really accepted all the deal, they should comply and withdraw without the use of force and without contact or without clashes with the Lebanese army. It didn't happen yet. And the Lebanese army didn't deploy yet in all the south. They deployed only in the area of Marjayoun, where Hezbollah withdrew. And I remind that this is a Christian area in South Lebanon where Hezbollah is not welcome. So let's wait and see the next days, as I said.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. General Khalil Hellu, thank you.
Thank you.
We can speak now to career expert Dr. Jim Hoare. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were the first British representative to Pyongyang. You were also stationed in Seoul as a diplomat during the 1980s. And I want to start by asking you, we've had about 24 hours to take stock of these unexpected developments in South Korea. I mean, what's your take on what on earth is going on there?
I think Mr. Yoon rather lost the plot. He was always a rather marginal president in a sense that he only won by the slimmest of all majorities. I mean, less than 1%. The lowest of any South Korean president. And until recently, his party was in command of the National Assembly, but they lost that at the last National Assembly election. And instead, the opposition came in with a huge majority and have been both very critical of the president's wife for accepting expensive gifts and not declaring them, and also more recently for they overturned the budget proposals and proposed a much reduced budget. This seems to have fazed Mr. Yoon, who took the action he did on the 3rd to declare martial law without, it would seem to me, much preparation. I mean, I would have thought that if you were going to do that, you would have had all your troops in position, ready to take over the Parliament building and strategic things like the media and so on. None of that seems to have been arranged. Some troops were sent to the National Assembly, but they quickly retreated when they met the opposition of the lawmakers and some of the crowd outside. So it seems to have been an ill-thought-out panic decision, which was rescinded as soon as it was opposed.
And, of course, the pretext that President Yoon gave for imposing martial law was the necessity to defend South Korea from pro-North Korean so-called anti-state forces. I mean, let's be clear, were there any specific threats, would you say?
No. I think that's dog whistle sort of tactic. That there are certain themes that the South Koreans always use, that there are opposition favours the North, and therefore it must be communist-inspired, which I don't think there was any evidence for whatsoever, and that has disappeared from the public pronouncements. No, I think that was just a standard smear, if you like.
Okay, so as you say, logistically, few preparations were made, no credible or clear threat from the DPRK. So that still begs the question, what was the South Korean president trying to achieve, do you think?
I think he was trying to be able to do things as he wanted to do them, particularly to get his budget through, to stop the criticism of his wife. And if you close down the National Assembly, then you could do both of those things. Or so he thought, but it clearly has completely misfired, and it looks as though there'd be a fair chance he will be out of office before very long, and possibly then facing criminal charges. It's ironic in a sense, because he was the chief prosecutor of Park Geun-hye, who was the president, but not one before last, who was ousted following an impeachment and imprisoned, later pardoned, but imprisoned. To say he was the prosecutor in that case.
Right, so a twist of irony as well. I mean, of course, you know both Koreas well. You've served in both the North and the South, which makes your knowledge particularly rare and valuable. Just how fragile, would you say, is the state of democracy looking to you in South Korea right now?
Well, I think it was a late developing flower. There's no doubt about that. It really only dates from the early 1990s, when there was a peaceable transfer from the last of the military rulers, President Roh Tae-woo, to a long-term civilian politician, Kim Yong-sam. And then it passed from him peacefully to Kim Dae-jung and so on. So I think it has become well established. And as a point I was hearing frequently last night in some commentaries, that those who've actually experienced martial law would now be people in their as adults, probably in their 60s and so on. It stopped in 1980 when Chun Tae-wan came to power, and once he'd made himself president, then martial law was lifted. So there's been quite a long tradition now when no government has resorted to martial law because it didn't see the necessity of it. And I think, frankly, that's how the population will have reacted. A lot of the population will have reacted to this particular move. There was no need for it. There was no increased threat from the North or any other major problem. This was, I think, President Yoon either panicking or being frustrated at not being able to do what he wanted. And so he chose this blunderbuss approach, if you like.
Okay, so no martial law in South Korea in 44 years, since 1980, as you said. So before the time you were serving there as a diplomat. Notable for us to mention as well that there are some 28,000 US troops based in South Korea. And we're hearing now that from the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, that Washington wasn't actually informed of this decision to impose martial law. Do you find that rather surprising?
I have, my impression is that Mr. Yoon made this decision on his own rather suddenly, without really informing anybody. It was not very sensible not to inform the United States, but then if he had done, there's a fair chance that somebody would have leaked that news, that he was planning to do this. So I can understand that the American concern that here is a very close ally. As you say, there are American troops on the ground in South Korea. They are an important part of the defense of South Korea, and yet they were blindsided on this occasion.
Just lastly,
mind you, I don't think in past declarations of martial law, I don't think the Americans were informed either. I think there's probably a track record there.
Okay,
you do these things.
Sure, and I just wanted to ask you lastly, I mean, we've had some pretty dramatic scenes in Parliament during the course of the last 24 hours in Seoul. There have been some large protests, we understand. I just want to ask for your sort of thoughts as to where you see things heading to from here, Dr. Hoare.
Well, I would be very surprised if Parliament doesn't go ahead with an impeachment process. I mean, I think it's not just the opposition party which has a majority in the House, but also the smaller parties in the House. And some of Yoon's own party have been saying he shouldn't have done this. He should be impeached. So I think that we will see a move in Parliament in the next few days to impeach the president. Now everybody is on alert to make sure that if there is another attempt at anything like a military intervention, that the protests will be very strong and very, very marked. And if the impeachment goes ahead, then it goes to the courts. And I think Yoon might find himself a convicted criminal. But that's speculation on my part. But I think there's going to be a period of uncertainty, but it looks as though the opposition is going to be in control. Yoon's own secretariat, the staff of the Blue House, have all offered their resignation, and his government doesn't seem to be his government doesn't seem to want to support him either. So I think his days are numbered.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, career expert Dr. Jim Hoare. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, for more analysis on the situation, we can speak now to Yo Han-koo, a former trade minister for South Korea under President Moon Jae-in. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. You've been quoted in the media as saying that President Yoon has made a grave mistake. Why do you say that?
This is 21st century Korea, and it was about 40 years ago that the previous, the Korean president used this martial law. But now, Korea is fully democratized, and, it was really kind of stunned many Korean people last night. So I think it could really weaken his political base because of this martial kind of law, the action last night.
Okay, we understand there were no specific threats with regards to North Korea, which President Yoon actually had cited. So what do you think he was trying to achieve?
His approval rating has been hovering around, 17, 18, 19% for the last, the last few weeks. And then, he has been sort of kind of going through a tough time because of some of the kind of scandal related to the First Lady. And also, right now, the Korean National Assembly is really dominated by the opposition party. So many of these key policy initiatives were really blocked by this opposition party. And I guess that might have really frustrated him as well. So I don't know. I mean, nobody really know, what the President Yoon was trying to achieve with this very radical and surprise martial law action. But obviously, that really, was a kind of grave misjudgment or kind of a mistake he made.
Do you think he's likely to survive, or would you say that impeachment was the likely next step forward for President Yoon Suk-yeol?
I think it remains to be seen. Unfortunately, Korea had the similar experience about 7-8 years ago when the former President Park was impeached. Right now, we feel like this unfortunate deja vu is coming back. And right now, in order to impeach the president, we have to go through a few steps. First, this the vote by National Assembly has to be passed. Right now, this in order to impeach, it needs two-third majority, and right now this opposition party is only 8 seats short of this two-third majority. So it depends on this 8, kind of vote from the ruling party, whether some of these ruling party lawmakers could defect to this, kind of the impeachment camp. So, but now, I mean, the last night, it was really surreal and stunning movement, and many Korean people were really, how can I say, outraged and frustrated by this sudden move by President Yoon. So obviously, right now, for the next few weeks, this impeachment will be really at the front and center of the Korean politics, and we have to, see how this turned out to be.
When you got the news, I'm just wondering what went through your mind.
I just thought it was fake news. I mean, last night when I got this text from my friend, my first reaction was that it shouldn't be real. I mean, it must be fake news or some joke or something. So that really shows that, I mean, it's a 21st century, and Korea is one of the most, highly advanced and also most democratized, countries in the world. And I mean, nobody might have expected that we could see such a scene that we saw, like, movies from this 40 years ago could replay again in reality.
Now, I've heard you in other interviews linking the situation in South Korea and the sense of frustration that you just described there to the advent or the return of Donald Trump to the White House in Washington. What's the connection?
I think it's a, weird coincidence, but actually in 2017, when Donald Trump was inaugurated, just only a few months later, the Korean president at that time, Park, was impeached. Right now, this Donald Trump 2.0 will be inaugurated in January 20th. And then now Korea is entering into a new, this impeachment kind of, debate and this political turmoil. So unfortunately, it's a kind of weird coincidence or, deja vu, coming back.
Yeah, and people in Washington must be pretty worried looking at South Korea these last 24 hours, a key ally. 28,500 US troops are stationed in your country. We understand that Washington wasn't even informed that martial law was about to be declared. Do you think that there is any sort of lasting diplomatic fallout from all of this?
I wouldn't, amplify the fallout from this last night's saga. I think, the good news is that this, martial law was kind of lifted only after about 6 hours later. And it shows that the Korean, the democracies is alive and resilient. And right now, the Korean politics is kind of shifting towards this impeachment, debate. So again, this is also, based on this, National Assembly and this democratic process. So yes, obviously, Washington might have been surprised, and also more kind of information sharing and more discussion need to be carried out on both sides. But I think, we have to be a bit more patient.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to the pretext for the martial law being imposed, which was this threat cited by President Yoon from North Korea. Turns out there was no specific threat, or not that we know of. But I'm just wondering what this says about relations between the two countries and the fact that some fears over North Korea can cause political paralysis across the border in your country. Do you think North Korea might try to exploit this?
I mean, considering this security, environment that South Korea face in regard to North Korea, I mean, we always have to be vigilant about the possibility of North Korean provocation or manipulation in this kind of vulnerable, situation. During this administration, this Korean government has been really kind of hawkish, maintaining hawkish stance when it comes to North Korea. And also North Korea also kind of shifted their policy, stance towards South Korea as they are sort of giving up on reunification and seeing South Korea as a main kind of enemy, and so on and so forth. So this tension has been quite escalating, and as we know, recently North Korea sent their troops to Ukraine, and probably there might have been very dangerous kind of a transaction in terms of sensitive technology transfer from Russia to North Korea. So when we look at all these security circumstances, we cannot underestimate the possible provocation by North Korea in this kind of situation.
One of your colleagues in South Korea, Kim Min-seok, who is a senior Democratic Party official, described what's happened in the last 24 hours as follows. He said, "We have an abnormal president with an abnormal presidential wife who tried to protect abnormal power." What do you have to say to that?
I think really it's unfortunate that, that we find ourselves in this kind of, situation. And, there is obviously, political differences between different parties, and there might be some, confrontation, etc. But I think it's always important to bring together these different parties and kind of embrace different opinions and kind of, find solution through compromise and, discussion. But looks like this kind of process was kind of a missing, for the last, few months or, years in this administration. So I think we need to, bring back this, normality into this political environment again.
Yeah, OK, so 6 hours of martial law have now come to an end. We've had some dramatic scenes in Parliament. There's been some major protests, some unions calling for a general strike. I mean, how do you see the next few days unfolding for South Korea?
Right now, this opposition party is really, kind of moving into this the impeachment mode. In the National Assembly. And then, as I said, whether, this National Assembly could achieve this two-thirds majority to get it approved in the National Assembly, that would be really critical scene, which will determine the fate of this president and also the fate of this Korean politics for coming month. So, but I would say that because of the, the last night surprise, this saga related to this martial, the martial law, the invocation, I think this, this Korean public were very, how can I say, disappointed, and then sort of lost confidence in the the current government. So we have to see how this Korean public and the National Assembly kind of find a solution and try to normalize the situation in coming weeks and months.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. We really appreciate it. Johan Koo, former Trade Minister for South Korea, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's find out more now about the significance of these developments in South Korea, the reality behind the perceived threat level from Pyongyang, and find out more about the reality of life in North Korea, where we can speak to Timothy Cho, a North Korean human rights activist and two-time defector who joins us from London. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. South Korea's President Yoon imposed this martial law last night, saying he's defending the country from North Korean anti-state forces. I'm just wondering, what did you think when you heard that news?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me. Well, I was quite shocked as my role, particularly human rights activist, and I'm also secretariat for the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group of North Korea, and continue monitor on this situation and both inside and outside of North Korea. But something was happening in South Korea yesterday, and I first thought it was a fake news, but which I confirmed with the governmental report of Korea. It was happening, and but following the President Yoon's statement, and this was not what he actually said. I'm citing that direct threat from North Korea and the nuclear threat from North Korea, but it was more likely he was referring the within internal political opposition. But he also then adding that part of anti-North Korean forces. So it's quite been, of course, the political situation in South Korea is very divided at the moment, and extremely divided between pro-North Korean side, or we may also mentioning a far left group in South Korea, and in terms of the political situation in the country. And he probably felt there was quite extreme movement of it, and especially within the parliament. And even though he's the president, I think his role might be quite limited to do so in many ways, including the budget plan for next year. I'm not exactly sure, however, was it really necessary that he had to declare martial law, which is very unprecedented, and even call the special force entering the parliament and blocking with order to arrest or even could kill someone under that constitution. So, and I have to say, frankly, it was quite shocking to see, particularly South Korea today, we regard such a democracy, and I was very alarming and carefully following the development and the situation in South Korea. Of course, it was after 6 hours, and the martial law lifted, which relieved me. However, the political situation remained quite uncertain in this country, and I continue watch the situation and which way it may develop in the coming weeks, especially opposition parties and the groups and all across the country, as well as you follow the news right now. Okay. And they call impeachment or ask the president to step down from what it's been happening over the past few hours.
Yeah, and of course, Timothy, you grew up in North Korea, and I'm just wondering how you think all of these developments in South Korea are viewed by the North.
Well, if you ask me as a North Korean escapee, an activist, and grew up my life within the totalitarian system, it's something not possible in North Korea, this kind of martial law or movement or even the president's use of the force and try to calm the political situation, by all means, nothing is possible in North Korea. Even any protest or military coup happens in North Korea, the government come out with the all available weaponry, including tanks or even air flight, and they could just wipe away all these protesters involved. And of course, there is no media search follows, and the international attention come to scrutinize, and media are going to ask experts and politicians around the world about the situation on such country, like what happens last night in South Korea. I think it is happening because South Korea is a democratic country, and it is quite sad. The results were the president had to use the last resort of military and martial law. And if it was no alternative choice for him to make such a decision, and I would personally, of course, have a number of questions for him, would he really have had to use this kind of the final options? However, still comparing, as I was even talking or following the conversation with my North Korean colleagues and activist colleagues, and we still talked about this, where this such development or movement or what happened, or even people gathered at the parliament, over 4,000 people within a couple of hours gathered in South Korea. That is such not happens in North Korea. I wonder, however, what was North Korean regime's viewpoint? Particularly, they were watching on this, what was happening in South Korea. And certainly, if there were any kind of movement was motivated, encouraged from North Korea's related groups in South Korea, what we call far left, maybe quite far left group, or North Korean supportive groups. And I think that's such amusing for North Korea, particularly with current situation where North Korea has been stepping into even international the security threat and joining Putin's illegal war, the reputation and has been gaining by themselves. And also they even declared the first time and admitted at the United Nations that they have prison camps and even executing political prisoners by all means, and people who have been expressing against the regime, or those repatriated North Korean refugees during their escape, and who also had contact with missionaries or attended churches, and such as all these, North Korea regard them as spy, and that spy, the punishment comes what they so-called political prisoners. So I felt it was quite a dangerous moment as well, providing this platform and atmosphere to the North Korean regime and make this uncertainty and atmosphere and within South Korean politics and society all across. I mean, of course, South Korea is not alone, as you can imagine. And I am based in the United Kingdom, and we were carefully watching the situation in South Korea last night. And also we do know that there are over 28,000 US and NATO troops are currently stationed in South Korea defend North Korea's nuclear threat.
Okay.
So we as North Koreans and SKPs especially, we still think because that was democracy and democratic order of this country, and such things were possible within few hours. Martial law declared or lifted the martial law after 6 hours. And but I have to concern that what's going to come over the next few weeks, and how this might provide opportunity for the North Korean regime as well.
Yeah, I just want to ask you a little bit more about how North Koreans feel towards the South Koreans, and I'm talking here at the sort of the level of the normal person on the street. You've described in a British newspaper being taught to hate South Koreans when you were in North Korea. Just tell us how you learned that.
So South Korea is the enemy to all the education level in North Korea. And along, of course, they always regard South Koreans as the enemy along with the Western side. I mean, if you see two types of brainwashing educations in North Korea, which implementation starts from age 12 months. But the first brainwashing education in North Korea is you are brainwashing them to believe and think and actually the Kim family as your God and great leaders. That brainwashing education starts from age 12 months when they start work by bowing to Kim family picture frames in every household in North Korea. But the second brainwashing education is very interesting. It is about anti-religious education. Why? They are brainwashing you that such as religion and particularly and Christianity, it is American religion, and they try to use that religion to destroy to North Korean communist society. So this anti, by all means, that word and spectrum of the whole atmosphere towards the U.S. and whole Westerns. And then they call South Korea a puppet of the Western imperialists, which I grew up in North Korea, and many of my friends and generations, we believed and in that one way or another. And I also believed the first Kim, Kim Il-sung. I thought he was God. And when he died, I genuinely cried overnight and not eating well, in which I was even asking for my father, who was a history teacher in high school.
And what do you think of him now, Timothy? What do you think of him now when you think back about Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il and the rest of the Kim dynasty? What are your thoughts about them today?
Well, they're nothing more than just a man, and whose ambition and created the country as a large prison society and close people's eyes and block ears and brainwashing from very young age, and media the media blockade from both outside and inside. It is a tragic, the country, how it has created a huge prison, I could call a prison country in the world. And there are 25 million people locked in this cage, and they cannot see, they cannot watch, they cannot listen, but they have to forcibly act and speak and think as the Kim, which is very sad. It is one of the reasons I have become a human rights activist myself, to speak and raise awareness of the situation. And I'm sure the regime, what's been maintaining, holding such as the darkest we so-called the Hermit Kingdom, it won't go that far. Of course, it has been there over the past 70 years, but generations growing, and they desire and they want to see the truth. They can block it and completely, as the state has and the regime has failed to destroy the hope and future and all of this. What generations desire continue move forward in this way between inside and outside.
Timothy, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, just lastly, I don't know if you have any contact with anyone in North Korea at the moment. Just tell us what you know with regards to the situation there right now.
Well, we do hear from inside family members. It can be both direct and indirectly. However, as you know and the world knows, there are no such mobile phones, internet, social media, or Zoom call like you can invite me all the way from London available. But the situation is bad inside North Korea, and it's been around 17 years I escaped from this country, but the situation has been getting worse and worse. However, what it means, complete closure of the borders and barely escape anyone from inside the country, what I did years ago. Maybe that could be the last stage of the process, and especially with the international uncertainty movement, what is come to expect. And yet, people from outside haven't stopped, continue stand and fight against the regime.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. Timothy Cho, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this special edition of Global News Today. Thanks for watching, and wherever you are in the world, if you're celebrating Christmas, we wish you all the very best.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not